Some sounds were never meant to exist. In 1979, those sounds were recorded, and even hardened homicide detectives couldn't listen without breaking. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the Toolbox Killer, when evil found its instruments. Now relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We're descending into the mind of a demon who didn't hide in shadows. He drove through sunlit California streets in a silver van, smiling at teenagers, offering rides. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker didn't just cross the line between human and monster. He erased it entirely, wielding ordinary hardware store tools as instruments of orchestrated terror. What he and his accomplice documented wasn't just murder, it was the methodical destruction of innocence, recorded on tape, calculated on calendars, perfected through practice. 5 young women, 5 months of summer. One toolbox filled with unspeakable purpose. This is the story of how 2 predators found each other, made a pact written in blood, and turned a 1977 GMC van into a rolling chamber of horrors that still haunts investigators 4 decades later. The California men's colony at San Luis Obispo wasn't designed to be a breeding ground for evil, but that's exactly what it became in 1978 when 2 inmates discovered they shared more than just a cell block. They shared fantasies. Dark, specific, meticulously detailed fantasies about abduction, torture, and murder. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was 44 years old, a career criminal with a genius-level IQ of 138 and absolutely no capacity for empathy. Born in Pittsburgh in 1940, adopted at infancy, his childhood read like a textbook case of antisocial personality disorder in development. He'd been in and out of institutions since age 12: theft, hit and run, assault, kidnapping attempts. The pattern was clear. Bittaker didn't see other people as human. He saw them as objects, as opportunities. His criminal resume was extensive, but his true nature had remained partially hidden behind bars. Until he met Roy Lewis Norris. Norris was different in temperament but identical in depravity. Born in Greeley, Colorado, he'd bounced through foster homes and reform schools, accumulating a record of sexual violence that should have kept him locked away permanently. He'd been released from Atascadero State Hospital, a facility for mentally disordered sex offenders, just 5 years earlier, deemed no longer a danger. That assessment would prove catastrophically, fatally wrong. When these 2 men connected in prison, something clicked. They didn't just become friends, they became partners with a shared business plan. The business was death. Their conversations started casually enough, the way predators always test the waters. Bittaker would mention a fantasy. Norris would elaborate. Neither man showed revulsion or hesitation. Instead, they found validation, permission, partnership. They began planning with chilling precision. This wouldn't be spontaneous violence born from rage or opportunity. This would be systematic, scientific. They would abduct girls, specifically girls, one representing each teenage year from 13 to 19. They would torture them using methods that maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of premature death. They would document everything. They would dispose of bodies where they'd never be found, and they would get away with it. The planning went beyond mere fantasy. They discussed vehicles, settling on a van that could be soundproofed and modified. They discussed locations along the Pacific Coast Highway where teenagers congregated, vulnerable and trusting. They discussed tools, specific implements that could inflict particular kinds of agony. They discussed timing, how long they could keep victims alive, conscious, aware of what was happening to them. Bittaker kept notes, detailed notes. He sketched diagrams. He created lists. His intelligence, which might have made him a successful professional in any legitimate field, was entirely devoted to perfecting murder. When Bittaker was released on November 15, 1978, the countdown began. Norris followed on June 14, 1979. Within weeks, they'd reconnected outside prison walls. Within days of that reunion, they'd purchased the van, a 1977 GMC cargo van, silver with sliding doors on both sides, perfect for concealment, perfect for abduction. They christened it Murder Mac. The van became their workshop. They soundproofed the interior with padded carpeting. They installed a custom bed in the back. They removed the passenger seat to create more room for their activities. They stocked it with supplies: rope, duct tape, wire hangers, pliers, screwdrivers, an ice pick. Tools. Simple, common, available at any hardware store. They called it their toy box. During this preparation phase, they practiced on sex workers, refining their abduction techniques and testing the soundproofing. These women survived barely, and their reports to police went nowhere. The complaints were filed, noted, and forgotten. The system failed to recognize that two predators were conducting dry runs, learning from mistakes, perfecting their methodology. By June 1979, Bittaker and Norris were ready. They'd rehearsed. They'd equipped themselves. They'd identified hunting grounds: Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, places where young people gathered, hitchhiked, walked alone after dark. The shopping list was complete. Now they just needed inventory. On June 24, 1979, they found their first victim. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, 16 years old, was walking home from a church event in Redondo Beach. Pretty, trusting, completely unaware that the silver van slowing beside her contained two men who'd spent months planning exactly how they would destroy her. Norris approached her with practiced ease, friendly smile, casual conversation. He asked for directions. She stepped closer to help. That's when Bittaker opened the sliding door. They grabbed her, pulled her inside, and Murder Mac lurched away from the curb. Lucinda screamed. The soundproofing worked perfectly. What happened to Lucinda Schaefer over the next hours was so brutal that the details would later make seasoned homicide detectives physically ill. Bittaker and Norris took turns. They violated her repeatedly. They tortured her with their tools. They recorded her screams, her pleas, her prayers. Bittaker took photographs, trophies to review later. When they'd exhausted their interest, they strangled her with a wire coat hanger, twisting it with pliers to ensure the job was thorough. They wrapped her body in plastic, weighted it, and dumped it in the San Gabriel Mountains. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was never found. Her family waited for her to come home. She never did. Bittaker and Norris returned to their apartment and reviewed their recordings. They discussed what went well, what could be improved. They were satisfied but not finished. They'd captured a 16-year-old. According to their plan, they needed more. On July 8, 1979, just 2 weeks later, they spotted Andrea Joy Hall. She was 18, hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway after a day at the beach. The silver van pulled over. Norris leaned out with that same friendly smile. "Need a ride?" Andrea climbed in. The door slid shut. Murder Mac claimed its second victim. Andrea's torture was even more prolonged than Lucinda's. Bittaker had purchased an audio recorder specifically to document their activities, and this time they captured everything in horrifying detail. Her screams, her begging, her final moments. They kept her for 2 days in their apartment, continuing their violations and tortures. When they finally killed her, they strangled her with their hands, watching her face as the life drained away. Her body was disposed of in the mountains, tossed down a canyon like garbage. The monster had found its rhythm. 2 girls dead in 2 weeks, and summer was just beginning. What's terrifying about this period isn't just the brutality. It's the normalcy that surrounded it. Between murders, Bittaker and Norris lived ordinary lives. They worked odd jobs. They drank beer and watched television. They blended seamlessly into suburban California. 2 middle-aged men who attracted no suspicion whatsoever. The van sat in their driveway waiting. The tools remained in the toy box waiting. And all along the beach communities of Los Angeles County, teenage girls walked, laughed, lived their lives, completely unaware that a silver GMC van was hunting. September 1979. The heat hadn't broken yet across Southern California, and beaches remained packed with sun worshippers and teenagers savoring the last weeks before school resumed. Among them, two 15-year-old girls decided to hitchhike home from a day at the beach, a common practice in the carefree late 70s, before stranger danger became ingrained in American consciousness. Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp were best friends, inseparable, the kind of teenage girls who shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about their futures. On September 3rd, they shared something else. They became the only victims abducted together by Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. The silver van pulled alongside them on the Pacific Coast Highway. Two friendly, middle-aged men. Smiles, casual conversation, an offer of a ride that seemed harmless enough. Jackie and Leah exchanged glances they'd hitchhiked dozens of times before without incident, and climbed into Murder Mac. The door slid shut, the locks engaged, and these two friends, who'd probably promised each other they'd be friends forever, spent their final hours on Earth experiencing hell together. What Bittaker and Norris did to Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp exceeded even their previous depravity. Having two victims simultaneously seemed to excite them to new levels of cruelty. They forced the girls to watch what was done to the other. They made them participate. They recorded everything, documenting not just the physical violations but the psychological torture of watching your best friend being destroyed. The audio recordings from this abduction, which would later surface as evidence, captured sounds that defy description. Teenage girls begging not for their own lives but for their friend's life to be spared. Promises to do anything, endure anything, if only the other could go free. The predators laughed at these pleas. They fed on the desperation. Jackie and Leah were kept alive longer than previous victims, not out of mercy but because Bittaker and Norris wanted to prolong their entertainment. They drove the van to a remote area in the San Gabriel Mountains, continuing their assaults in isolated darkness where screams couldn't reach another human soul. When they finally decided to end it, they chose different methods for each girl, apparently curious about comparative suffering. Jackie was strangled. Leah was bludgeoned with a sledgehammer. Their bodies were thrown over a cliff in the Angeles National Forest, discarded in brush where they'd remain hidden for months. The killers returned home, cleaned the van, and celebrated. They'd now murdered 4 girls. Their confidence was absolute. They believed themselves invincible, smarter than police, luckier than fate, protected by some dark providence that favored their particular brand of evil. They were wrong about the invincibility, but that revelation was still weeks away. Throughout September, Bittaker and Norris continued their normal routines while privately reveling in their crimes. They listened to the recordings repeatedly, reliving the experiences. Bittaker organized his photographs into careful albums, cataloging his trophies. Norris bragged, cautiously in veiled terms, to acquaintances about sexual conquests, unable to completely contain his twisted pride. Nobody suspected. Nobody looked twice at the silver van. Nobody connected the missing girls. Reported by frantic families but lost in the vast machinery of 1970s law enforcement where missing teenagers were distressingly common and often assumed to be runaways. The predators had created a perfect system. They hunted in populated areas where victims were abundant but where the sheer number of people provided anonymity. They selected victims who fit certain physical criteria: young, attractive, vulnerable, but who weren't so distinctive that their disappearances would trigger massive manhunts. They disposed of bodies in wilderness areas where decomposition and scavengers would destroy evidence. And they developed appetites that were growing rather than sating. On October 31st, 1979, Halloween night, because the irony appealed to their twisted sense of humor, they went hunting again. This time they spotted Shirley Lynette Ledford, 16 years old, at a gas station in Los Angeles. She just left a Halloween party and was trying to get home to her family. Shirley was their final victim, though they didn't know it yet. What they did to her would ultimately be their undoing. Not because this murder was more brutal than the others, but because they documented it so thoroughly that the evidence would become irrefutable and devastating. When Norris approached Shirley at that gas station, offering a ride with the van idling nearby. She hesitated. Something felt wrong. Her instincts screamed warning. But it was late, she was tired, and the neighborhood wasn't great. She made the fatal calculation that thousands of teenagers had made before her. The risk of accepting a ride seemed smaller than the risk of walking alone in the dark. She climbed into the van. Bittaker was waiting inside. The door slammed. Murder Mac claimed its fifth and final victim. What followed was systematically recorded on audio tape. A cassette that would later be played in court and would become legendary among law enforcement as the most disturbing piece of evidence in American criminal history. Prosecutors warned jury members before playing it. Multiple jurors wept. One had to be excused from the courtroom. Even the judge visibly struggled to maintain composure. The tape captured everything. Shirley's initial confusion turning to terror. Her screams as she realized what was happening. Her pleas for mercy. Her prayers. The sounds of the tools being used, the ice pick, the pliers, the screwdrivers. Bittaker and Norris talking casually, almost conversationally, about what they were doing to her. Jokes, laughter, and through it all, Shirley's voice, breaking, sobbing, begging, until finally fading into silence. They kept her alive for hours, inflicting injuries that would make medical examiners recoil when they later cataloged them. They used every tool in their toy box. They took turns. They recorded it all for posterity, for future pleasure, for the ultimate trophy. When Shirley Lynette Ledford finally died, not from any single injury but from the cumulative trauma of systematic torture, Bittaker and Norris wrapped her body and dumped it on a random lawn in Hermosa Beach. Unlike their previous victims, they didn't bother hiding her. Perhaps they were too confident. Perhaps they'd grown careless. Perhaps some part of them wanted to display their work. A jogger found Shirley's body at sunrise on November 1st. The Halloween night horror was discovered in morning light, and the investigation that would finally bring down these monsters lurched into motion. But even as police began processing the scene, even as Shirley's family received the devastating news, even as a community began to realize a predator was among them, Bittaker and Norris felt no fear. They'd executed 5 perfect murders. They'd left no witnesses. They'd disposed of 4 bodies so thoroughly those girls would never be found. They believed they were untouchable. They were about to discover otherwise. Roy Norris had a weakness that Lawrence Bittaker either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. Norris couldn't keep his mouth shut. Where Bittaker was calculating and controlled, Norris was impulsive and boastful. He needed validation. He needed to share his exploits, even if sharing meant risk. In the weeks following Shirley Ledford's murder, as police intensified their investigation and media coverage exploded, Norris began dropping hints to people he knew. Nothing explicit, he wasn't quite that foolish, but suggestive comments, veiled references, the kind of statements that let someone imagine themselves into confidence without providing concrete admissions. One of those people was an old prison acquaintance named Jimmy Dalton. Another was Norris's former wife. A third was a casual friend who'd served time and understood the criminal code against snitching. Each heard pieces of the story. Each initially dismissed it as exaggeration or fantasy, the kind of bullshit convicts sometimes spun to seem tougher than they were. But Shirley Ledford's body had been found. The news was everywhere. A 16-year-old girl, tortured and murdered, her body casually discarded like trash. Police were calling it one of the most brutal homicides in Los Angeles history. The public was terrified. Rewards were being offered. Jimmy Dalton started putting pieces together. The timeline matched. Norris's strange comments suddenly seemed less like fantasy and more like confession. And Dalton had his own legal troubles. Charges pending, pressure mounting. When police brought him in on an unrelated matter, he saw an opportunity. He told them about Roy Norris, about cryptic conversations and disturbing implications, about a silver van and 2 men who might be responsible for the murder everyone was talking about. The police were skeptical. They'd been flooded with tips since Shirley's body was discovered, most of them worthless. But something about Dalton's information rang true. They ran Norris's name. His record came back. Serial rapist, released from a mental hospital, history of violent sexual offenses. They ran his known associates. Lawrence Bittaker appeared, career criminal, kidnapper, recently released from prison. On November 20th, 1979, detectives obtained a warrant and raided the residence Bittaker and Norris shared in Burbank. What they found inside that apartment exceeded their worst expectations. Photographs, hundreds of photographs, girls in various states of undress and distress. Some were clearly dead. Others captured moments of obvious agony. The images were organized meticulously, sorted and labeled like some nightmarish hobby collection. Audio tapes, multiple cassettes, carefully marked with dates and initials. The detectives didn't listen to them immediately. They'd need proper evidence protocols, but their existence was damning. And the tools, ice picks, pliers, wire hangers twisted into garrotes, sledgehammer, all cleaned but showing microscopic evidence of use. They found the van outside Murder Mac, looking ordinary and innocent in daylight but harboring secrets in every fiber of its soundproofed interior. Forensic teams would later extract hair, blood, and other biological evidence from that van, creating an ironclad chain of physical proof. Bittaker and Norris were arrested separately. Both initially denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming, and their alliance, forged in shared depravity, crumbled under pressure. Norris broke first. He was weaker, more susceptible to manipulation, more terrified of what awaited him. When prosecutors offered a deal, testify against Bittaker and avoid the death penalty, Norris accepted. He confessed to everything: the planning, the abductions, the tortures, the murders. He provided details only the killer could know, walking investigators through each crime with chilling precision. He led them to the dump sites in the San Gabriel Mountains. Search teams recovered remains of Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp, confirming Norris's account. Forensic analysis matched the bodies to the photographs and descriptions. Lucinda Schaefer and Andrea Hall remained missing, their bodies lost in the vast wilderness, but Norris's testimony about their murders was detailed enough to eliminate reasonable doubt. He knew things about those girls, about their final moments, their last words, the specific locations where they'd been held, that couldn't be explained away. Bittaker maintained his innocence longer, but the evidence was insurmountable. The photographs were his. The handwriting in the planning notes was his. His fingerprints were on the tools. His voice was on the audio recordings, captured forever directing tortures and joking about suffering. Most damningly, there was the Shirley Ledford tape, the complete, unedited recording of her final hours. When Bittaker's attorney heard it during evidence review, he reportedly went pale and immediately advised his client to consider a plea deal. Bittaker refused. His arrogance remained intact even as the walls closed around him. The trial was scheduled for 1981. The prosecution had 2 years to prepare its case, and they used every day of that time. They assembled a mountain of physical evidence. They lined up expert witnesses who could explain the forensic connections. They prepared psychological profiles that would help jurors understand the defendant's pathology. And they had Roy Norris, ready to testify about every detail of their partnership in murder. But perhaps most importantly, they had that audio tape. The prosecutors knew that tape would be the single most powerful piece of evidence. More compelling than photographs, more convincing than testimony, more devastating than any forensic analysis. That tape captured evil in real time. It documented suffering in its rawest form. It would force jurors to confront exactly what these men had done. The defense attorneys fought desperately to keep it out of evidence. They argued it was prejudicial, that it would inflame jurors beyond reason, that its probative value was outweighed by its emotional impact. They were right about all of that and wrong about what mattered. The judge ruled the tape was admissible. Jurors deserved to hear the truth. During this preparation period, more information about Bittaker and Norris's activities emerged. Police connected them to several assaults on sex workers that hadn't resulted in murder. Investigators in other jurisdictions began reviewing unsolved disappearances, wondering if the body count might be higher than 5. The media coverage was relentless. Toolbox killers became the headline shorthand, referencing the implements they'd used. The phrase captured public imagination and revulsion simultaneously. Hardware stores reported customers expressing discomfort purchasing certain items: ice picks, pliers, wire hangers, as if the tools themselves had been contaminated by association with such evil. Families of the victims struggled with devastating knowledge. The Schaefers, the Halls, the Gilliams, the Lamps, the Ledfords. These people had lost daughters in the most horrific way imaginable, and now they had to endure media scrutiny, trial preparations, and the terrible anticipation of hearing exactly what their children had suffered. Some chose to attend the trial. Others couldn't bear it. All of them wanted justice, even as they recognized that justice, whatever form it took, could never truly balance the scales of what had been stolen from them. As 1981 approached, Los Angeles braced itself for a trial that would expose the absolute depths of human cruelty. The evidence was assembled. The witnesses were prepared. The courtroom was scheduled. All that remained was to present the case and let 12 citizens decide whether Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris would live or die for what they'd done during that terrible summer of 1979. The monster was caged. Now came the reckoning. The trial of Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker began on January 19, 1981, in Los Angeles Superior Court. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, spectators, family members, legal observers, all drawn to witness what was already being called one of the most significant murder cases in California history. Prosecutor Stephen Kay stood before the jury and made a promise. He would prove beyond any doubt that the defendant had participated in the abduction, torture, and murder of 5 teenage girls. He would present physical evidence, forensic analysis, and eyewitness testimony, and he would play an audio recording that would remove any possibility of reasonable doubt. He kept that promise. The trial lasted for months, a methodical presentation of horrors. Roy Norris testified for days, walking the jury through every crime in excruciating detail. Defense attorneys tried to shake his testimony, suggesting he was lying to save himself, but Norris never wavered. His account was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by physical evidence at every turn. Forensic experts testified about the evidence recovered from the van: blood, hair, fibers, and explained how it connected to the victims. They presented the photographs found in Bittaker's possession and explained how they matched the wounds found on recovered bodies. They walked through the tools and demonstrated how each had been used. The families of the victims attended when they could bear it. Some left the courtroom during particularly graphic testimony. Others stayed, bearing witness to their daughter's final moments as an act of love and memorial. Their presence was a silent accusation, a reminder that these weren't just case numbers or forensic evidence. These were children who'd been loved, who'd had futures, who'd been stolen and destroyed. Then came the audio tape. Stephen Kay announced he would play the recording of Shirley Ledford's torture and murder. He warned the jury. He warned the spectators. He offered anyone who wanted to leave the opportunity to do so. Several people exited. Those who remained would never forget what they heard. The bailiff dimmed the courtroom lights. The tape player clicked on. And for the next few minutes, hell spoke through courtroom speakers. Jurors cried. Several covered their faces. One requested a break after just 60 seconds and had to be excused temporarily. The court reporter stopped typing, unable to continue through tears. Even the judge, a veteran of countless murder trials, visibly struggled to maintain composure. Shirley Ledford's voice filled the courtroom. Her screams, her pleas, her prayers, the sounds of tools being employed. Bittaker and Norris talking, joking, discussing what they were doing as casually as mechanics working on an engine. The audio quality was clear enough that every detail was audible. The scraping of metal, the creaking of the van's interior, the diminishing strength in Shirley's cries as shock and blood loss took their toll. When the tape ended, the courtroom sat in absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they just heard seemed to physically press down on everyone present. Lawrence Bittaker sat at the defense table, expressionless. He showed no remorse, no emotion, no recognition that anything unusual had occurred. That reaction, or lack thereof, may have been as damning as the tape itself. The jury could see they were dealing with something fundamentally broken, something that didn't register human suffering as meaningful. The defense presented its case, but there was nothing they could realistically argue. They couldn't deny the evidence. They couldn't explain away the photographs, the tools, the testimony, the tape. Instead, they focused on mitigation, arguing that Bittaker's troubled childhood and personality disorders should be considered, that life imprisonment without parole was appropriate rather than death. The jury deliberated. They convicted Lawrence Bittaker on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of rape, sodomy, and conspiracy. Then came the penalty phase, the determination of whether Bittaker would die for his crimes. Stephen Kay played the tape again. He reminded jurors of the 5 victims, of their ages, of the futures they'd never have. He argued that some crimes are so heinous, so fundamentally evil, that death is the only proportionate response. The defense argued for mercy, for life, for recognition that executing Bittaker wouldn't bring the girls back. The jury deliberated again. They returned with their verdict: death. Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to die in California's gas chamber. Roy Norris, as part of his plea agreement, received 45 years to life. He would be eligible for parole eventually, though given the nature of his crimes, release seemed unlikely. The families reacted with mixed emotions. Some felt justice had been served. Others recognized that no sentence could truly address what had been done. Lucinda's mother stated that she hoped Bittaker would suffer in his final moments as her daughter had suffered. Shirley's family expressed relief that the trial was over, but acknowledged that their pain would never end. Bittaker was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he would spend the next 3 decades. California's death penalty had become mired in legal challenges and appeals, effectively creating a moratorium on executions. Bittaker would never face the gas chamber or its successor, lethal injection. Instead, he would grow old in a cell, maintained at taxpayer expense, living far longer than any of his victims had. Over the years, Bittaker became a notorious figure in true crime culture. He gave interviews to researchers and journalists, speaking about his crimes with disturbing detachment. He expressed no remorse, instead treating his actions as intellectual exercises worthy of analysis. He died of natural causes on December 13, 2019, at age 79, more than 40 years after murdering 5 teenage girls. Roy Norris remained imprisoned in California's correctional system. He was repeatedly denied parole, with boards citing the horrific nature of his crimes and his lack of genuine rehabilitation. He died in prison on February 24, 2020, at age 72, just 2 months after his partner in murder. The audio tape from Shirley Ledford's murder remains one of the most restricted pieces of evidence in criminal justice history. It's used occasionally in FBI training to demonstrate extreme criminal pathology, but even seasoned agents struggle to listen to it completely. Prosecutors who've heard it describe nightmares that lasted for years. The tape represents something most people cannot comprehend: a recording of evil at its most pure and unfiltered. The case changed how law enforcement approached serial predators. The methodical planning Bittaker and Norris employed, their use of a mobile killing space, their documentation of crimes, all of it informed future investigations and prevention strategies. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit studied the case extensively, developing profiles that would help identify similar offenders before they could accumulate victims. It also changed public consciousness about hitchhiking and stranger danger. The casual trust of the 1970s, when teenagers thought nothing of accepting rides from strangers, died along with Lucinda, Andrea, Jackie, Leah, and Shirley. Parents became more vigilant. Young people became more cautious. A certain innocence was lost. The mountains where the bodies were dumped remain largely unchanged. Hikers occasionally stumble across remains. Whether from these crimes or others, it's often impossible to determine. The San Gabriel Wilderness keeps its secrets well. Hermosa Beach, Redondo Beach, Manhattan Beach, these communities continued on, but the shadow of those summer months in 1979 never fully lifted. Older residents remember. They remember when the silver van was prowling their streets. They remember when their children weren't safe walking home from church events. They remember the panic, the fear, the relief when the monsters were finally caught. And they remember the victims. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, 16 years old, who wanted to be a teacher. Andrea Joy Hall, 18 years old, who loved the ocean and photography. Jackie Gilliam, 15 years old, who dreamed of being a veterinarian. Leah Lamp, 15 years old, who played piano and wanted to study music. Shirley Lynette Ledford, 16 years old, who loved Halloween and was trying to get home to her family. 5 girls, 5 summers they never saw. 5 entire lifetimes of experiences, relationships, accomplishments, joys, and sorrows that were stolen by 2 men who saw them not as human beings but as objects for entertainment. The toolbox that gave the killers their nickname was entered into evidence, cataloged, and eventually destroyed. The tools themselves, ordinary implements you could buy at any hardware store, were rendered sinister by context. They'd been used to inflict suffering, and their destruction felt like exorcism, removing contaminated objects from the world. The Van Murder Mac was crushed and scrapped. Destroying it couldn't erase what had happened inside, but it ensured that no morbid collector could acquire it, that it couldn't become some grotesque trophy. The legacy of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris is a testament to the darkest capabilities of the human psyche. They weren't insane in any legal sense. Both understood right from wrong and chose wrong deliberately. They weren't driven by psychotic delusions or compulsions they couldn't control. They were simply evil, finding pleasure in inflicting pain, bonding over shared sadistic fantasies, and acting on those fantasies with methodical precision. The case reminds us that monsters don't always look monstrous. They drive ordinary vans. They smile and offer rides. They blend into suburban neighborhoods. They pass through daily life without raising suspicion. The horror isn't just what they do. It's how easily they hide among us. For the families of the victims, there is no closure. They carry their daughters' absences every day. They mark birthdays that will never be celebrated, graduations that never occurred, weddings that never happened, grandchildren who were never born. The grief doesn't end. It shifts, transforms, becomes something they carry rather than something that carries them, but it never disappears. The officers, prosecutors, and forensic experts who worked the case carry their own scars. Many required counseling. Some left law enforcement entirely, unable to continue after exposure to such concentrated evil. Those who remained were changed, seeing threats where others saw normalcy, unable to forget what humans were capable of inflicting on each other. The audio tape, Shirley's final screams preserved forever on magnetic tape, serves as an eternal reminder. As long as that recording exists, locked in evidence archives, the truth of what happened during that summer of 1979 cannot be denied, minimized, or forgotten. Evil found its instruments in a hardware store toolbox, but justice, eventual and imperfect, found its voice in a courtroom. And 5 girls who deserved so much better are remembered not just as victims of monsters, but as children who were loved, who mattered, whose lives, however brief, had value that transcends the darkness that ended them. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Hereditary Killer. Terry Blair and Kansas City's Family of Death, aka the Prospect Avenue Predator. In the shadowed streets of Kansas City's most forgotten neighborhoods, where survival often meant looking the other way, a predator moved through the darkness. But this wasn't just any killer. This was a man born into violence, raised in chaos, and seemingly destined to continue a family legacy written in blood across 3 generations. The Blair family name didn't just appear once in Kansas City's criminal records. It appeared dozens of times, spanning mother to son to brother to nephew, creating what prosecutors would later call a generational curse of violence. But Terry Blair's crimes would eclipse them all, turning a family's dark history into his own personal nightmare that authorities struggled to stop. Between 2001 and 2004, women began vanishing from the streets near Prospect Avenue, their bodies discarded like refuse in abandoned lots and behind crumbling buildings. The killings shared disturbing patterns, and when investigators finally connected the dots, they uncovered something that chilled even seasoned homicide detectives. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, protected by a system that had released him despite every warning sign screaming that he would kill again. To understand Terry Blair, you must first understand where he came from. And the Blair family tree reads like a catalog of human depravity that stretched back decades before Terry ever committed his first crime. His mother, Janice Blair, wasn't just a troubled woman. She was convicted of killing her husband when Terry was just 7 years old. The act itself was brutal, committed in their Kansas City home while the children were present, shattering whatever innocence childhood might have offered. Growing up, Terry watched his siblings follow similarly destructive paths. His brother Clifford was eventually convicted of murder. Another brother fell into the criminal system. A nephew would later be charged with multiple killings of his own. The Blair household wasn't simply dysfunctional. It was a breeding ground for violence, where abuse, neglect, and criminal behavior formed the very foundation of daily existence. Terry absorbed these lessons early, learning that human life held little value and that violence was simply another tool for getting what you wanted. By his teenage years, Terry Blair had already begun his descent into serious criminality. But unlike some who gradually escalate, Blair's violence erupted with shocking intensity. In 1982, at just 21 years old, he committed an act so vicious it should have kept him behind bars for life. Angela Graves was pregnant with Blair's child when their relationship soured. What happened next revealed the depths of Blair's capacity for cruelty. On a summer evening, in a moment fueled by rage and a complete absence of empathy, Blair kidnapped Graves. What followed wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated, sustained brutality. He took her to a location where her screams wouldn't be heard, where no one would interrupt what he planned to do. And then he unleashed violence that went beyond murder into the realm of torture. Angela Graves was beaten savagely, her body subjected to injuries that spoke of prolonged suffering. But Blair wasn't finished. He sexually assaulted her, adding violation to the horror she endured. When he finally ended her life, he also ended the life of his own unborn child. The crime scene told investigators everything they needed to know about Terry Blair. He was dangerous, remorseless, and capable of extreme violence without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming. The brutality was undeniable. Blair was arrested, tried, and convicted of second-degree murder. The sentence? 21 years. It seemed substantial in 1982, but what happened next would haunt Kansas City for decades. Blair didn't serve his full sentence. Despite the horrific nature of his crime, despite the clear danger he posed, the system that was supposed to protect society made a catastrophic decision. In 2001, after serving just 19 years, Terry Blair walked out of prison a free man. Authorities had released a killer back onto the streets, a man who had tortured and murdered a pregnant woman, who had shown zero remorse, who had been raised in violence and knew nothing else. Parole officers would later claim he was monitored, that check-ins were conducted, that the system was watching. But they weren't watching closely enough. Blair returned to Kansas City, to the same economically devastated neighborhoods where poverty and desperation created the perfect hunting ground for predators. The areas around Prospect Avenue had deteriorated significantly during his incarceration. Abandoned buildings stood like tombstones marking the death of community investment. Women struggling with addiction and survival sex work walked these streets at night, vulnerable and often invisible to society. Terry Blair saw opportunity in their vulnerability. He began frequenting areas where women gathered, studying patterns, identifying those who wouldn't be immediately missed. His approach was patient at first. He wasn't the impulsive young man who had killed Angela Graves in explosive rage. Prison had taught him something, though not remorse or redemption. It had taught him caution, strategy, and how to avoid detection. For several months after his release, Blair maintained a low profile. He reported to his parole officer. He found work. He appeared to the casual observer to be successfully reintegrating into society. But beneath that surface, something dark was taking shape. Blair began establishing relationships with women in the sex work community, becoming a familiar face, someone who seemed less threatening than other men prowling these streets. He learned their routines, their desperation, their need for money that made them willing to get into cars with strangers. And then, in late 2001, women began to disappear. The first victim's body was discovered in an overgrown vacant lot, partially concealed by debris and vegetation. She had been strangled, her life crushed out of her by hands that had done this before. The positioning of her body suggested the killer had taken time with her, that her death hadn't been quick. Detectives noted the location, isolated enough for privacy but accessible enough that the killer could come and go without drawing attention. It was the work of someone familiar with the area, someone who understood which streets had cameras and which didn't, where homeless encampments provided cover and where patrol cars rarely ventured. The victim was eventually identified as a woman known to work Prospect Avenue. She had a history of drug charges, survival crimes, the kind of record that meant her disappearance hadn't triggered immediate alarm bells. To society, she existed on the margins. To the killer, that made her perfect. Weeks passed. Then another body appeared, dumped behind an abandoned building like garbage left for collection. Same neighborhood, same victim profile, same cause of death, strangulation, but with evidence of beating, of violence that went beyond what was necessary to end life. The killer was making them suffer. Kansas City homicide detectives recognized the pattern immediately. They were dealing with a serial offender, someone targeting vulnerable women in a specific geographic area. Task forces were assembled. Resources were allocated. But in neighborhoods where violence was common and trust in police was minimal, getting information proved extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses didn't come forward. Sex workers, understandably terrified but also wary of police involvement, kept silent. The killer continued operating in darkness, protected by the very marginalization of his victims. Body 3, Body 4, Body 5. Each discovery brought renewed media attention, public outcry, and pressure on law enforcement to stop the killing. But the killer remained a phantom, careful not to leave obvious forensic evidence, methodical in disposal, and protected by the simple fact that his victims lived in a world most people chose to ignore. Then, in what would prove to be a crucial mistake born of arrogance or compulsion, the killer did something that would ultimately lead investigators directly to him. He called 911. The call came in during the early morning hours, patched through to the Kansas City Police Department's emergency dispatch. The voice on the other end was male, calm, almost conversational, which made what he said even more chilling. He told the dispatcher he wanted to report the location of a body. Dispatchers are trained to handle crisis calls, to maintain composure even when hearing disturbing information. But something about this call was different. The caller wasn't frantic or upset. He spoke with eerie detachment, providing specific details about where police could find the woman's remains. When the dispatcher asked how he knew this information, the caller's response froze everyone listening to the recording. Because I put her there. He wasn't calling to report a crime he'd witnessed. He was calling to take credit. Over the next several minutes, the caller described not just one victim but multiple women he claimed to have killed. He provided locations, details that only the killer could know, information that hadn't been released to the public. And he did it all with a disturbing sense of pride, as if narrating accomplishments rather than confessing to murder. The dispatcher kept him talking, following protocol, trying to extract as much information as possible while traces were run on the call's origin. The man on the phone seemed to enjoy the conversation, the attention, the power inherent in holding information that would send homicide detectives scrambling to crime scenes across the city. He described how he selected his victims, women he deemed worthless, disposable, whose deaths he rationalized as cleaning up the streets. The language he used was dehumanizing, reducing human beings to objects, obstacles, problems he had solved through violence. When asked his name, he refused to provide it. But he didn't hang up. He kept talking, revealing details about his methods, about how he approached these women, gained their trust, got them alone, and then unleashed violence that transformed quickly from control to slaughter. The call was being recorded. Every word was being preserved as evidence. And while the caller seemed to understand this intellectually, his compulsion to brag, to be recognized for what he'd done, overrode any sense of self-preservation. Finally, after more than 10 minutes, the call ended. The killer simply hung up, vanishing back into the darkness from which he'd emerged. But he'd made a fatal error. Investigators immediately began analyzing the call with every technological resource available. Voice analysis, linguistic patterns, background noise. Everything was scrutinized for clues. The locations he'd provided were immediately dispatched to patrol units, and within hours, officers confirmed what they'd feared. Bodies were exactly where the caller said they'd be. This wasn't someone making false confessions or seeking attention through lies. This was the actual killer, and he'd just handed police a roadmap to his crimes. The media seized on the story with predictable intensity. Headlines screamed about the taunting killer and voices from hell. Public fear escalated as residents realized a serial murderer wasn't just operating in their city. He was confident enough to call police and describe his work. Task force investigators worked around the clock analyzing every aspect of the call. They cross-referenced known sex offenders in the area, parolees recently released, anyone with a history of violence against women. The list was depressingly long. Kansas City had no shortage of violent men with disturbing records. But one name kept surfacing as they narrowed parameters: Terry Blair. Detectives pulled his file and felt the cold recognition that comes when puzzle pieces suddenly align with horrifying clarity. Blair was a convicted murderer who had killed a woman before. He'd been released from prison in 2001, right around when these new murders began. He lived in the area where the bodies were being discovered. And when voice analysts compared the 911 call recording to known samples of Blair's voice from prison phone calls and court proceedings, the similarities were striking. They had their suspect, but having a suspect and having sufficient evidence to secure a conviction are very different things. The team needed more physical evidence, witness testimony, something that would withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. Surveillance began immediately. Unmarked vehicles tracked Blair's movements. Undercover officers documented his patterns, where he went, who he interacted with, what times he frequented Prospect Avenue. The operation required careful coordination. Push too hard and risk alerting Blair that he was being watched. Move too cautiously and risk letting him kill again. While surveillance continued, investigators dug into Blair's activities since his release. They interviewed his parole officer, who painted a picture of a man who appeared compliant but emotionally flat, showing none of the rehabilitation markers that typically indicate successful reintegration. Blair attended required meetings but never engaged meaningfully. He expressed no remorse for his past crimes, no insight into his behavior, no genuine effort toward change. He was, the parole officer admitted in retrospect, simply going through motions, playing a role designed to keep authorities satisfied while his true nature remained hidden beneath a thin veneer of cooperation. Detectives also located witnesses who'd seen Blair with some of the victims shortly before they disappeared. Sex workers who knew him described a man who could be charming initially but whose demeanor would shift unpredictably to aggression and threats. Several women reported disturbing encounters with Blair where they'd felt genuinely afraid for their lives but hadn't reported these incidents to police due to their own legal vulnerabilities. The investigation revealed that Blair had essentially been operating openly for years, his violence barely concealed, but protected by the marginalization of his victims and the reluctance of witnesses to engage with law enforcement. As evidence accumulated, prosecutors prepared for arrest. They coordinated with the task force to execute the operation at a time and location that would minimize risk to the public and maximize the chance of taking Blair into custody without incident. On a spring morning in 2004, as Terry Blair left his residence, multiple units moved in simultaneously. Officers surrounded him, weapons drawn, shouting commands. For a moment, Blair seemed to consider resisting. His body tensed, his eyes calculating odds. But he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He complied, allowing himself to be handcuffed, remaining silent as officers read him his rights. As they transported Blair to headquarters for interrogation, detectives felt both relief and grim satisfaction. They'd removed a serial killer from the streets, but they also knew the real work was just beginning, building a case strong enough to ensure Blair would never walk free again. Terry Blair sat across from two seasoned homicide detectives in an interrogation room designed to be deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lighting, bare walls, the kind of sterile environment that strips away pretense and forces confrontation with reality. But Blair seemed entirely unaffected. He leaned back in his chair with the casual posture of someone waiting for a bus rather than someone facing multiple murder charges. His expression was neutral, almost bored, as detectives began their questioning. They'd been interrogating suspects for decades between them, had seen every type of criminal defense mechanism from complete denial to theatrical breakdowns. But Blair presented something different, utter indifference. He didn't seem anxious about being caught, worried about consequences, or concerned with mounting a defense. Detectives started broad, establishing timeline and locations, giving Blair opportunities to provide alibi information that might exonerate him. He answered some questions with minimal responses, ignored others entirely, and occasionally smirked as if enjoying some private joke at their expense. When confronted with the 911 call recording, Blair's expression finally shifted, not to fear or regret, but to something closer to satisfaction. The detectives played the audio, letting Blair hear his own voice describing murders, providing body locations, reveling in the power of his actions. "That you?" one detective asked. Blair's response was chilling in its simplicity. Silence, followed by a slight shrug that neither confirmed nor denied but conveyed complete absence of remorse. The interrogation continued for hours. Detectives presented evidence methodically. Witness statements placing Blair with victims shortly before their disappearances, forensic evidence linking him to crime scenes, phone records showing his movements coinciding with murder timelines. With each piece of evidence, they expected some crack in Blair's facade, anxiety, anger, defensive deflection. Instead, they got only cold calculation. Blair seemed to be assessing their case not from a position of innocence, but from the perspective of someone evaluating whether they had enough to convict. When one detective directly asked if Blair had killed these women, he finally spoke more than a few words. "You already think you know. Why does it matter what I say?" It was deflection, but it also revealed something crucial about Blair's psychology. He didn't deny the killings because denial would require him to care about the consequences. Instead, he simply refused to provide the confession prosecutors wanted, understanding that making them prove every element of their case was his only remaining strategy. As interrogation stretched into a second day, detectives tried different approaches. They brought in photographs of the victims, not crime scene photos, but pictures showing these women as people, as daughters, mothers, sisters. The strategy was to humanize the victims, to force Blair to confront the reality of lives he'd destroyed. Blair glanced at the images with the same detachment he'd shown throughout questioning. No emotion flickered across his features. No recognition of humanity or suffering registered in his eyes. One detective, frustrated by Blair's lack of response, leaned forward and asked the question that had haunted investigators since discovering the pattern. Why? Why these women? What did they do to deserve this? Blair's answer was perhaps the most disturbing thing he said during the entire interrogation. Nobody deserves anything. Things just happen. It was nihilism distilled to its most toxic form. A worldview where human life held no intrinsic value, where violence was simply action without moral weight, where suffering was meaningless and death inevitable. The interrogation yielded no confession, but it provided prosecutors with something equally valuable. A clear picture of the defendant they'd be presenting to a jury. Terry Blair wasn't going to show remorse. He wasn't going to claim temporary insanity or diminished capacity. He was going to force the state to prove their case while he sat impassively, offering nothing, conceding nothing, providing no window into his motivations or psychological state. As authorities formally charged Blair with 6 counts of first-degree murder, the full scope of his crimes began emerging. Each victim's story was tragic in its own right, lives marked by struggle and survival, women trying to exist in circumstances most people couldn't imagine. Victim 1. Shalia McKinsey, 25 years old, last seen getting into a vehicle near Prospect Avenue. Her body was discovered in a vacant lot, strangled, with evidence of beating that suggested prolonged violence before death. Victim 2. Patricia Wilson Butler, 45 years old, mother of multiple children, disappeared after leaving to meet someone who'd called her. Her remains were found behind an abandoned building, showing similar patterns of strangulation and assault. Victim 3. Darcy Warden, 25 years old, known to police through previous encounters but trying to rebuild her life. She vanished after working late one evening. Her body later discovered in conditions that indicated she'd been killed elsewhere and dumped. Victim 4. Nelia Harris, 33 years old, survived by family who described her as kind despite her struggles with addiction. Her death matched the same pattern: strangulation, evidence of violence beyond what was necessary to cause death. Victim 5. Sandra Reed, age 47, disappeared in circumstances nearly identical to the others. Her body was found weeks later, decomposition making forensic analysis difficult but evidence still pointing to homicidal strangulation. Victim 6. Carmeline Hibbs, 30 years old, last seen by friends who tried to warn her about getting into unfamiliar vehicles. Her body was discovered in a location consistent with the killer's established pattern. 6 women, 6 lives ended brutally. 6 families left to grieve while struggling with the stigma society attached to their loved ones' circumstances. Prosecutors worked tirelessly building individual cases for each murder, knowing that Blair's defense team would challenge every piece of evidence, question every witness, and exploit any procedural weakness. The stakes were absolute: secure convictions or watch a serial killer potentially walk free again. Meanwhile, Blair sat in jail awaiting trial, showing no emotion, expressing no concern, seemingly content to let the machinery of justice grind forward without his participation. The trial of Terry Blair began amid intense media scrutiny and public outrage. The courtroom gallery was packed daily with family members of victims, local residents demanding justice, journalists documenting every detail, and true crime observers drawn to the spectacle of a serial killer prosecution. Blair entered the courtroom each day with the same unsettling composure he'd displayed throughout his arrest and interrogation. He wore a neutral expression, showed no apparent anxiety, and interacted minimally with his defense attorneys. To observers, he seemed almost disinterested in his own fate, as if the trial was merely an inconvenient formality. The prosecution opened with a devastating presentation of evidence. They began with the 911 call, playing the recording for jurors and watching their reactions as Blair's voice filled the courtroom describing murder with casual detachment. The impact was immediate and visible. Jurors recoiled, their faces registering horror at the killer's tone, his pride, his complete lack of human empathy. Over subsequent days, prosecutors methodically built their case. Forensic experts testified about evidence collected from crime scenes. DNA analysis linked Blair to multiple victims. Fiber evidence connected him to locations where bodies were discovered. Cell phone records placed him in the vicinity of disposal sites at times consistent with the murders. Witness testimony proved equally damaging. Women who'd had frightening encounters with Blair described his approach. Initially friendly, then rapidly shifting to aggression when they refused his advances or tried to leave. One survivor recounted an incident where Blair had violently grabbed her, threatened her life, and only released her when someone else appeared nearby. Her testimony was harrowing, providing jurors with a living example of the terror Blair inflicted on his victims before killing them. Medical examiners detailed the injuries found on each victim's body, explaining that the strangulation methods used required sustained pressure and would have caused prolonged suffering before death. This wasn't quick or merciful killing. It was violence that allowed Blair to watch his victims die, to experience their final moments of terror and helplessness. The prosecution also presented evidence of Blair's previous murder conviction, arguing it demonstrated a clear pattern of violence against women that had continued unabated despite his incarceration. They showed Angela Graves' case file, reminding jurors that Blair had tortured and killed before, that he'd shown zero rehabilitation during 19 years in prison, and that his release had led directly to more deaths. Blair's defense team faced a nearly impossible task. They couldn't credibly deny their client's guilt given the overwhelming evidence. Instead, they attempted to challenge the strength of evidence for individual murders, arguing that while Blair might be guilty of some crimes, the prosecution hadn't proven all charges beyond reasonable doubt. They questioned the reliability of witnesses with criminal histories. They challenged forensic procedures, suggesting contamination or mishandling of evidence. They argued that the 911 call, while disturbing, didn't specifically name Blair as the caller despite voice analysis suggesting it was him. But their arguments gained little traction. The evidence was simply too comprehensive, too interconnected, and too damning. Blair's own behaviors and statements, his lack of alibi, his refusal to offer alternative explanations, his complete absence of emotion when confronted with victims' photographs, all worked against any reasonable doubt defense. Perhaps most powerfully, victim impact statements brought the human cost of Blair's crimes into sharp focus. Family members testified through tears about daughters, mothers, and sisters they'd lost. They described the anguish of not knowing what happened to their loved ones, the horror of learning they'd been murdered, and the ongoing trauma of living with Blair's brutality. One victim's daughter addressed the court, speaking directly to Blair. "You didn't just kill my mother. You killed part of all of us. You took away her future, our future together, and you did it for no reason except your own evil pleasure." Blair showed no response. He sat motionless, his face blank, offering no acknowledgement of her words or her pain. The trial lasted several weeks, but the jury's deliberations were relatively brief. After carefully reviewing evidence and testimony, they returned with verdicts that sent a clear message: guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Family members sobbing with relief, spectators expressing satisfaction that justice had been served, while Blair himself remained utterly impassive, as if the verdicts concerned someone else entirely. Sentencing came weeks later, and the judge pulled no punches in his remarks. He described Blair as one of the most dangerous offenders he'd encountered in decades on the bench, someone who showed no capacity for rehabilitation and posed an ongoing threat to society. The sentences were handed down consecutively, life imprisonment on each count, totaling multiple lifetimes without possibility of parole. Terry Blair would die in prison. There would be no early release, no parole hearings, no second chances. The system that had failed by releasing him in 2001 was ensuring it wouldn't make that mistake again. As officers led Blair from the courtroom for the final time, he showed the only emotion anyone had seen from him throughout the entire process. He smiled. Not a smile of relief or resignation, but something colder, a final reminder that behind his human features existed something fundamentally broken and irredeemable. The aftermath of Blair's conviction brought some closure to families, but it also sparked broader conversations about systemic failures. How had someone with Blair's history been released after serving only 19 years for torture and murder? What supervision had actually occurred during his time on parole? Why had it taken multiple murders before authorities connected the pattern? Investigations revealed troubling answers. Blair's parole monitoring had been minimal, check-ins perfunctory, risk assessments inadequate. The system designed to protect society had operated on assumption rather than vigilance, treating Blair as a low-risk offender despite every indicator suggesting otherwise. Reforms followed, including enhanced monitoring for violent offenders, longer mandatory sentences for murders involving torture or particular cruelty, and increased resources for investigating crimes against marginalized communities. These changes came too late for Blair's victims, but they represented acknowledgement that the system had failed and needed fundamental restructuring. The Blair family's legacy of violence didn't end with Terry's conviction. His nephew, Diamond Blair, was later arrested and convicted of murdering multiple women in circumstances eerily similar to his uncle's crimes, targeting vulnerable women, using strangulation, disposing of bodies in abandoned areas. The generational pattern continued, raising disturbing questions about whether criminality can be inherited or if environment creates these monsters. For the women of Prospect Avenue and similar neighborhoods throughout Kansas City, Blair's conviction brought mixed emotions. Relief that he was off the streets, but also grim recognition that he wasn't the only danger they faced. Sex workers continued operating in conditions of vulnerability and marginalization, prey for any predator willing to view them as less than human. Advocates for these communities intensified efforts to provide resources, support, and most importantly, recognition that these women's lives mattered, that their deaths deserved investigation with the same urgency as victims from more privileged backgrounds. Years after Blair's conviction, his name remains synonymous with Kansas City's darkest period of serial violence. The case is studied in law enforcement training programs as an example of both investigative success and systemic failure. It serves as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They sometimes look like ordinary men, walking familiar streets, hiding behind compliance while planning their next atrocity. Terry Blair is now in his 60s, serving his life sentences in a maximum security facility. He has granted no interviews, provided no insights into his crimes, and expressed no remorse for the lives he destroyed. He exists in perpetual confinement, a fitting end for someone who showed others no mercy. The 6 women he murdered are remembered by those who loved them, not as statistics or case files, but as people who deserved better than the fate Blair inflicted upon them. Their names are spoken at vigils, written in memorial gardens, and carried in the hearts of family members still processing the loss. In the end, Terry Blair's story isn't really about him. It's about systemic failures that allowed him to kill again. It's about marginalized women whose deaths weren't prioritized until a body count forced action. It's about generational cycles of violence that society fails to interrupt. And it's about the families left behind, forever marked by brutality they never could have prevented. The horror of Blair's crimes will never be forgotten in Kansas City, nor should it be. Remembering ensures vigilance, honors victims, and reminds us that evil exists not as some supernatural force, but as choices made by people who decide that other lives don't matter. Terry Blair made that choice 6 times that we know of, and now he'll spend the remainder of his days paying the price, locked away from a society he terrorized and women he can never harm again. Justice came late, but it came completely, and that will have to be enough. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our 3rd story. Story 3. The Daniel Blank Case. Some men don't just break. They shatter into something far worse. What happens when a human being decides to stop being human altogether? We're tracking a predator who wore the mask of normalcy so well that nobody saw the abyss staring back, until bodies started appearing, and the man behind them revealed a hunger that law enforcement had never encountered before. Daniel Blank didn't just kill. He turned murder into a ritual, transforming living, breathing human beings into trophies for a collection nobody knew existed. Tonight, we descend into the mind of a man who believed he was beyond consequence, beyond morality, beyond humanity itself. Daniel Blank existed in plain sight, a ghost walking among the living in New York City during the early 1970s. He was 33 years old, physically unremarkable, the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Average height, slender build, brown hair cut conservatively. He worked as a manager at a manufacturing company, lived alone in a modest apartment on the Upper East Side, and maintained the outward appearance of a functional, law-abiding citizen. But appearances are the greatest lies we tell ourselves. Behind the carefully constructed facade, Daniel Blank was disintegrating. His marriage had collapsed 3 years earlier, leaving him adrift in a sea of isolation he couldn't navigate. The divorce hadn't just ended a relationship, it had severed his final connection to anything resembling normal human attachment. His ex-wife had walked away, unable to recognize the man she'd married in the cold, distant stranger he'd become. The emptiness that followed wasn't the kind that heals with time. It was the kind that expands, consuming everything in its path until nothing remains but a void where a soul should be. Blank felt it growing inside him like a tumor, this absence of feeling, this terrible numbness that made the world seem flat and colorless. He'd wake up in his apartment, surrounded by silence so thick it felt like drowning, and realize he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything real. He tried to fill the void the way many desperate men do, with temporary pleasures, fleeting connections that meant nothing an hour after they ended. He frequented bars in Manhattan, picking up women whose names he'd forget before morning came. He took up mountain climbing, seeking adrenaline in dangerous ascents that should have terrified him but instead left him feeling more hollow than before. He experimented with drugs, hoping chemistry might restore what psychology had taken away. Nothing worked. The numbness only deepened. It was during one of his mountain climbing expeditions that something shifted inside Daniel Blank. He was scaling a particularly treacherous cliff face in the Adirondacks when his climbing partner, a young man named Thomas, lost his grip. Blank watched it happen in slow motion, the way the man's fingers slipped from the rock, the expression of pure terror that flooded his face, the way his body tumbled backward into empty air. Blank had been close enough to grab him, close enough to save him. Instead, he'd simply watched, mesmerized by the fall, by the way the man's screams echoed off the rock face, by the sickening crunch when the body finally stopped moving 300 feet below. And for the first time in years, Daniel Blank felt something. Not horror, not guilt, excitement, a rush of pure, electric sensation that flooded through his nervous system like fire through dry timber. He stood there on that cliff face, breathing hard, heart pounding, and realized with crystal clarity that he'd just discovered the cure for his emptiness. Death. Not his own, but someone else's. The power to end a life, to watch that final moment when everything that makes a person human simply stops existing. That was the drug he'd been searching for. The only thing strong enough to make him feel alive again. The authorities ruled Thomas's death an accident. Blank had been too far away to help, they said. These things happen in the mountains. No one suspected the truth, that Blank had let him fall deliberately, that he'd watched with fascination rather than horror, that he was already planning when he might experience that feeling again. Back in New York, Blank began to transform his apartment into something that reflected his new reality. He removed all the furniture that reminded him of his married life, stripping the space down to its essentials. The walls became bare, painted white. He installed thick carpeting that muffled sound. He began collecting ice axes, climbing equipment, knives, tools that could serve dual purposes. Most disturbing of all, he started keeping a journal. Not a typical diary of daily events, but something far more sinister. A detailed record of his thoughts about killing, his fantasies, his plans. He wrote about the euphoria he'd felt watching Thomas fall, how it had awakened something primal inside him, how the memory of it sustained him through days that would otherwise be unbearable. The problem with most people, he wrote in one entry, is that they're already dead inside. They walk around pretending to be alive, but there's nothing real happening behind their eyes. They're automatons following programming they don't even understand. When I kill one of them, I'm not really taking anything away. I'm just making the outside match the inside. This was how Daniel Blank rationalized what he was becoming, by dehumanizing his potential victims before he ever touched them. If they were already dead inside, if they were just meat puppets going through pre-programmed motions, then ending their lives wasn't murder. It was simply revealing the truth. He began stalking the streets of Manhattan at night, studying people, selecting potential targets. He developed a methodology, a way of choosing victims that felt almost scientific in its precision. He looked for people who seemed isolated, disconnected, alone in the crowd. People whose deaths wouldn't immediately be noticed, who wouldn't be missed right away. He followed them for days, sometimes weeks, learning their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He knew where they lived, where they worked, what time they left their apartments, which routes they took home. He memorized the details of their lives with obsessive precision, turning surveillance into a twisted form of intimacy. The stalking itself became its own source of pleasure, a prolonged foreplay to the violence he was planning. He'd stand in the shadows watching his chosen targets go about their mundane lives, feeling the anticipation build inside him like pressure in a sealed container. The longer he waited, the more intense the eventual release would be. His first deliberate kill came on a freezing December night in 1972. The victim was a young man named Frank Lombard, a minor city employee who lived alone in a walk-up apartment in the East Village. Blank had been following him for 3 weeks, learning every detail of his pathetic routine. Work, home, television, sleep. Day after day, the same meaningless cycle. Lombard was walking home from a late shift when Blank made his move. The streets were nearly empty, most people driven indoors by the bitter cold and the late hour. Blank had chosen his moment carefully. A stretch of poorly lit sidewalk between street lamps, a spot where shadows pooled thick enough to hide anything. He approached from behind, moving with practiced silence, the ice axe hidden beneath his long coat. Lombard never heard him coming, never had a chance to scream or run or fight back. The first blow struck the base of his skull with surgical precision, dropping him instantly. Blank stood over the fallen body, breathing hard, feeling that same electric rush he'd experienced on the mountain. But this time was different. This time it was deliberate, chosen, controlled. This time he'd hunted his prey and taken it down like a predator, and the sensation was beyond anything he'd imagined. He felt powerful, purposeful, awake in a way he hadn't been in years. He dragged the body into a nearby alley, working quickly despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He needed to get off the streets before someone came along. He'd planned this part too, a route through back alleys and service corridors that would take him back to his apartment without being seen, a way to dispose of evidence that minimized risk. By the time the police found Frank Lombard's frozen corpse the next morning, Daniel Blank was back in his apartment, reliving every moment in his journal, analyzing his technique, planning how he'd improve for next time, because there would be a next time. He was certain of that now. The emptiness inside him had finally found something that could fill it, and he wasn't going to stop. The monster had tasted blood, and the monster was still hungry. In the weeks following Frank Lombard's murder, Daniel Blank discovered something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Killing got easier. Not physically, the act itself remained brutal and demanding, but psychologically. The barrier that stops most humans from taking another life, that fundamental resistance hardwired into our social nature, had completely dissolved in him. The police were investigating Lombard's death as a mugging gone wrong. They had no suspects, no witnesses, no physical evidence pointing to anyone specific. The case quickly went cold, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved violent crimes in a city where murder was becoming increasingly common. This gave Blank tremendous confidence. He'd gotten away with it. He was smarter than the police, more careful, more disciplined. He waited 2 months before killing again. Patience was crucial, he'd decided. Patterns got people caught. Randomness was his ally. If he varied the timing, the locations, the victim profiles, he could keep operating indefinitely without drawing attention to himself. His second victim was Bernard Gilbert, a 42-year-old accountant who worked in Midtown and lived alone in a studio apartment near Gramercy Park. Blank had noticed him at a gym they both frequented. Another solitary man going through the motions of life without any apparent connection to anyone else. Perfect. He followed Gilbert for a month, learning his habits with the same obsessive thoroughness he'd applied to Lombard. Gilbert's life was even more predictable, even more pathetic. Work, gym, apartment, sleep. The man barely existed outside that narrow circuit. Blank struck on a Tuesday evening in February 1973. Gilbert was leaving the gym, walking the 6 blocks to his apartment through streets slick with half-melted snow. Blank had been waiting in a doorway across the street, watching, timing his approach perfectly. This time he used a different method, a knife rather than the ice axe, wanting to experiment with technique, to understand which tools produced which sensations. The kill was messier, more intimate. Gilbert struggled briefly, making small sounds of confusion before the blade found vital organs, and he went limp in Blank's arms. Blank felt that same electric rush, that same sense of profound aliveness. But something else came with it this time, a realization that disturbed him even in his deteriorating mental state. He was starting to enjoy not just the power of killing, but the specific details, the warmth of blood on his hands, the weight of a dying body, the final moments when awareness faded from a victim's eyes. He was developing preferences, refinements. He was becoming a connoisseur of murder. Bernard Gilbert's body was discovered the next morning in an alley 3 blocks from the gym. Again, police treated it as a random street crime. New York in the early 1970s was experiencing a surge in violent crime. Murders, assaults, robberies were becoming so common that individual deaths barely registered unless the victim was wealthy or connected. Gilbert was neither. His case received minimal investigative attention. Blank killed his 3rd victim in April, a young woman named Monica Roth, an assistant editor at a publishing house who lived in the West Village. This one was different, riskier. Women drew more police attention than solitary men. But Blank was growing bolder, more confident in his abilities. He'd been watching Monica for 6 weeks, fascinated by her isolation despite living in one of the city's most densely populated neighborhoods. She worked late most evenings, walking home through quiet residential streets around 10 or 11 at night. Blank chose a particularly dark stretch of sidewalk between Christopher Street and her apartment. He came up behind her quickly, using a garrote this time, another experiment in methodology. The kill was silent, efficient. She barely had time to realize what was happening before consciousness left her. But something went wrong afterward. A homeless man had been sleeping in a nearby doorway, and he'd seen Blank dragging Monica's body into an alley. The man didn't immediately understand what he'd witnessed. His brain, addled by years of substance abuse and mental illness, processed events slowly. By the time he started shouting, Blank was already 2 blocks away, disappearing into the night. Police found Monica Roth's body within an hour. And this time they had a witness. Not a good witness, not someone whose testimony would hold up in court, but someone who could provide a description. Male, average height, dark coat, moving quickly. Not much, but more than they'd had before. Detective Lieutenant Edward Delaney of the NYPD's Detective Division caught the case. Delaney was a veteran investigator, methodical and persistent, with an instinct for patterns that had made him one of the department's most successful homicide detectives. He'd been following the Lombard and Gilbert murders peripherally, noting similarities in the violence, the precision, the apparent lack of motive. Now, with Monica Roth, he began to wonder if they were looking at a serial killer. The term itself was relatively new. The FBI wouldn't establish its behavioral science unit for another few years, but Delaney had been reading about similar cases in other cities. He understood that some killers operated from compulsion rather than traditional motive, selecting victims based on opportunity and internal drives rather than personal connection. He started pulling files, looking for similar unsolved cases across Manhattan. What he found disturbed him. 6 additional murders over the previous 18 months that shared certain characteristics. Victims killed with unusual weapons, ice axes, garrotes, knives. No apparent motive. No sexual assault. No robbery. Just efficient, brutal killing followed by quick disposal of the body. Delaney began building a profile, trying to understand the psychology driving these murders. The killer was organized, disciplined, patient. He selected victims carefully and stalked them before attacking. He was physically fit, the kills required strength and speed. He was likely intelligent, capable of planning and executing complex operations without leaving significant evidence. Most importantly, Delaney realized the killer was escalating. The time between murders was decreasing. The risks he was taking were increasing. This wasn't someone who would stop on his own. This was someone who would continue killing until he was caught or killed himself. Delaney assembled a small task force, keeping the investigation quiet to avoid media attention that might cause panic or drive the killer underground. He had officers canvass neighborhoods where the murders had occurred, looking for anyone who'd been present at multiple crime scenes, anyone who seemed to be paying unusual attention to the investigations. Meanwhile, Daniel Blank was becoming increasingly reckless. The near miss with Monica Roth, the homeless witness who'd seen him, should have frightened him, should have made him pause and reconsider. Instead, it excited him. The danger itself was becoming part of the thrill, an additional source of adrenaline to fuel his addiction. He killed again in May, then June, then July. The pace was accelerating, the cooling-off period between murders shrinking from months to weeks. He was losing control of the compulsion, or perhaps he'd never had control to begin with. The murders had become the organizing principle of his life, the only thing that gave meaning to his otherwise empty existence. His apartment had become a shrine to his activities. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about the murders, maps of the city with crime scenes marked, photographs he'd taken while stalking victims. His journals now filled an entire shelf, volumes of densely written text documenting every detail of his operations, every thought and feeling associated with killing. He'd stopped going to work regularly, calling in sick or simply not showing up. His savings were dwindling, but he didn't care. Money didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the hunt, the kill, the brief moments of feeling truly alive. In August, Delaney's investigation finally caught a break. A beat cop noticed a man acting strangely outside a subway station, standing too still, watching the crowd with unusual intensity. The officer approached, asked for identification, and took down the man's information in his notepad. The man had been polite, cooperative, given his name without hesitation. Daniel Blank. The officer wouldn't have thought twice about the encounter except that later that same night, there was another murder 2 blocks away. Same MO, same efficiency, same lack of apparent motive. When the officer heard about the killing, something clicked. He remembered the man at the subway station, remembered the intensity of his focus, the way he'd been studying the crowd. He brought his notes to Delaney. The detective looked at the name, Daniel Blank, and felt the distinctive tingle that came with a solid lead. He ran the name through various databases, looking for any criminal history, any prior police contact. Nothing significant came up. Blank was clean, at least officially, but Delaney's instincts were screaming. He assigned surveillance teams to watch Blank's apartment, to track his movements, to document everything he did. What they observed over the following weeks confirmed Delaney's suspicions. Blank was following people, stalking them through the streets, exhibiting all the classic behaviors of a predator selecting prey. The trap was beginning to close, though Daniel Blank didn't know it yet. He was too consumed by his compulsion, too focused on his next kill, to notice the surveillance teams or the detective slowly building a case against him. The hunter had become the hunted, and the final confrontation was approaching fast. Detective Lieutenant Edward Delaney understood something crucial about hunting serial killers. You can't wait for them to make mistakes. You have to force the mistakes, create pressure that makes them act carelessly, expose themselves. Daniel Blank had been operating with near-perfect discipline for months, but Delaney knew that discipline was fragile, especially in someone driven by compulsion rather than logic. The surveillance of Blank's apartment revealed patterns that were simultaneously mundane and deeply disturbing. Most days, Blank would leave around noon, hours after a normal person would have gone to work. His employer had fired him weeks earlier, though Blank seemed either unaware or unconcerned about this development. He'd wander through Manhattan for hours, apparently aimless, but the surveillance teams noticed he always ended up in neighborhoods where previous murders had occurred. He was revisiting his crime scenes, reliving the kills. Classic serial killer behavior. Delaney watched hours of surveillance footage, studying Blank's body language, his movements, his interactions with others. What struck the detective most was the emptiness in Blank's expression. Even in crowds, surrounded by humanity, Blank looked utterly alone, disconnected from everything around him. His face showed no emotion except during specific moments, when he watched someone walking alone, when he studied potential victims, and then something would flicker behind his eyes, something predatory and hungry. The legal challenge was significant. Delaney had strong circumstantial evidence, but nothing concrete enough for an arrest warrant. No physical evidence connected Blank to any crime scene. No witnesses could positively identify him. The homeless man who'd seen him with Monica Roth had disappeared back into the streets, impossible to locate for a lineup. Everything Delaney had was suggestive, compelling to an experienced detective but insufficient for prosecution. He needed to catch Blank in the act or get him to confess. Both options were dangerous. If they moved too soon and failed to make charges stick, Blank would disappear or become so cautious they'd never catch him. If they waited too long, more people would die. Delaney decided to apply pressure indirectly. He arranged for news coverage of the investigation, making sure reporters mentioned that police had identified a suspect and were building a case. He wanted Blank to feel watched, to know the net was tightening. Paranoia might make him sloppy. The strategy worked, but not in the way Delaney anticipated. Instead of becoming more cautious, Blank accelerated. The news coverage seemed to excite him, to fuel his compulsion rather than restrain it. He killed twice in September, breaking his own pattern, throwing caution aside in pursuit of the rush he craved. The first September victim was David Morrison, a bartender walking home after a late shift. Blank attacked him on a nearly deserted street in Hell's Kitchen, using an ice axe with brutal efficiency. Morrison died before he hit the ground. Blank stood over the body for several minutes, much longer than his usual rapid escape, savoring the moment despite the enormous risk. Surveillance teams were too far behind to witness the actual killing, but they arrived in time to see Blank walking away from the scene, his coat stained dark with blood he hadn't bothered to hide. They followed him back to his apartment, watching as he entered the building, climbed the stairs, disappeared inside. Delaney now had enough for a search warrant. Officers executed it at dawn the next day, breaking down Blank's door with weapons drawn, expecting potential violence. What they found instead was a man sitting calmly at his kitchen table, drinking coffee, waiting for them with almost eager anticipation. "I wondered how long it would take," Blank said as they handcuffed him. "I've been quite careful, you know. Meticulous, really." The apartment was exactly what Delaney had expected based on his profile. Sterile, organized, and filled with evidence of obsession. The walls covered in clippings and maps. The shelves packed with journals documenting every murder in disturbing detail. The closet containing weapons. Ice axes, knives, garrotes, all meticulously cleaned and maintained. The photographs of victims, taken during the stalking phase, their faces captured in moments of ordinary life before Blank had ended them. But the most disturbing discovery was Blank's collection of trophies. Small items taken from each victim, a watch, a piece of jewelry, a wallet, carefully cataloged and displayed on a shelf like museum artifacts. Each one labeled with a date and a brief description. Subject 3, February 11th, 1973. Satisfactory technique. Good awareness maintenance. The clinical language, the reduction of human beings to numbered subjects and technical assessments, revealed the depth of Blank's psychological deterioration. He'd stopped viewing his victims as people long ago. They'd become nothing more than objects in his experiments, data points in his exploration of killing. During the initial interrogation, Blank was cooperative to the point of eagerness. He wanted to talk about what he'd done, wanted to explain his methodology, his philosophy. He spoke about the murders the way an artist might discuss his work, analyzing technique, discussing the evolution of his approach, expressing pride in his efficiency. "You have to understand," he told Delaney during one session, "most people are already dead. They're walking corpses, going through empty motions, pretending to be alive. I just made the outside match the inside. I revealed the truth about them." Delaney had interviewed dozens of killers during his career, but Blank's complete absence of empathy was unusual even in that context. Most murderers, even serial killers, showed some awareness that they'd done something wrong, even if they rationalized or justified it. Blank showed nothing. No remorse, no guilt, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with lives and families and value. "Do you understand that you killed people?" Delaney asked him. "Real people with families, friends, futures?" Blank considered this seriously, then shook his head. "No, I don't think that's accurate. I ended biological functions in organisms that were already functionally dead. There's a difference." Psychiatrists brought in to evaluate Blank's competency to stand trial were divided. His grasp of reality was clearly impaired. His delusional belief that his victims weren't truly human suggested serious mental illness. But he'd also demonstrated clear planning ability, awareness of legal consequences, and efforts to avoid detection. He knew what he was doing was illegal, even if he didn't believe it was wrong. The prosecution moved forward with multiple counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming: the journals, the trophies, Blank's own detailed confessions. His attorneys attempted an insanity defense, arguing that someone who genuinely believed his victims weren't human couldn't be held fully responsible for their deaths. The trial became a media sensation, one of the first times the American public was confronted with the reality of serial killers operating in their midst. Television coverage brought images of Blank into living rooms across the country, this ordinary-looking man who'd committed such extraordinary evil. People were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. During testimony, prosecutors read excerpts from Blank's journals, exposing the full scope of his pathology. He'd killed 13 people over 18 months, each murder documented with disturbing precision. He'd rated them, compared them, analyzed what worked and what could be improved. He'd treated human lives as raw material for his experiments in transcending emptiness. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Blank showed no reaction when the verdicts were read, no emotion when the judge sentenced him to multiple consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He'd stopped engaging with reality by that point, retreating into whatever internal world he'd constructed to justify his actions. But before sentencing, the judge asked if Blank had anything to say. Most defendants decline or offer brief apologies. Blank stood and spoke for 20 minutes, delivering a chilling monologue about consciousness, emptiness, and his belief that he'd discovered something profound about human existence through killing. "I felt more alive in those moments than most people feel in their entire lives," he said. "I touched something real, something beyond the lies we tell ourselves about meaning and purpose. You're sending me to prison, but you're the ones living in a prison. A prison of delusion, pretending your lives matter when they manifestly don't." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as guards led him away. Daniel Blank, age 34, would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security psychiatric facility, isolated from society, still writing in journals about his theories of existence and the beauty he'd found in ending life. The families of his victims attended every day of the trial, watching the man who destroyed their lives show no remorse, no recognition of their pain. For them, there would be no closure, no understanding that made sense of senseless loss. Their loved ones had been selected randomly, killed for no reason beyond one man's desperate attempt to feel something other than emptiness. Detective Delaney, who'd spent 8 months hunting Blank, felt no satisfaction in the conviction. He'd stopped 13 murders, but he hadn't been able to prevent them. 13 people were still dead, 13 families still grieving, because he hadn't caught Blank quickly enough. "You asked me once if I regretted what I'd done," Blank wrote to Delaney from prison years later. "I've thought about that question extensively. The answer is no. I regret only that I wasn't able to continue. Those were the only moments in my life when I was truly awake, truly present. Everything else was just waiting." Delaney never responded. Some questions don't deserve answers, and some evil is too profound to engage with. Daniel Blank had revealed something disturbing about human nature, that the mechanisms that make us capable of love and connection can break, leaving behind something that looks human but has lost everything essential about humanity. The monster had been caught, but the darkness he represented, the emptiness that could consume a person completely, remained out there in the world, waiting for the next broken soul to discover it. The capture and conviction of Daniel Blank didn't end the story. It simply shifted it into a different, equally disturbing phase. What happens after a monster is caged? What do we do with the knowledge that such people exist? That the person sitting next to you on the subway might be concealing an abyss behind ordinary eyes? The families of Blank's 13 victims struggled with questions that had no good answers. Why had their loved ones been chosen? What had Frank Lombard done to deserve being murdered on his way home from work? Why had Monica Roth's ambitions and dreams been extinguished before she'd reached 30? The randomness was almost worse than if there had been a motive. At least motive implies logic, implies that different choices might have led to different outcomes. Sarah Lombard, Frank's sister, attended every parole hearing Blank would theoretically become eligible for, though his consecutive life sentences made parole functionally impossible. She needed to be there, she explained to reporters, to ensure that the system remembered who her brother had been. He was a person, she said repeatedly. He had a name, a life, people who loved him. He wasn't just a number in a serial killer's journal. The psychiatric facility where Blank was housed became, reluctantly, a destination for researchers studying criminal psychology. What drove someone to kill without apparent motive? Could such a person be rehabilitated, or was the damage too fundamental? Blank himself was a willing subject for study, eager to discuss his crimes, his motivations, his internal experience. Dr. Margaret Chun, a forensic psychiatrist who spent 5 years studying Blank, emerged from the experience profoundly shaken. He has no emotional connection to other human beings, she wrote in her published case study. He understands intellectually that people experience emotions, have relationships, value their lives, but he doesn't feel any of it. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind from birth. The concepts don't translate because the fundamental experience is absent. What made Blank particularly disturbing, Dr. Chun noted, was his intelligence and self-awareness. He understood his condition, could discuss it analytically, recognized that his inability to connect with others was abnormal. "I'm broken," he told her during one session. "I've always been broken, probably. The marriage failing didn't create the emptiness. It just removed the last structure that was covering it up, forcing me to look at what was actually there, which was nothing." The question of whether Blank had been born this way or made into what he became consumed researchers. His childhood had been ordinary, even privileged. Upper-middle-class family, good education, no history of abuse or trauma. By all accounts, he'd been a normal, if somewhat emotionally reserved, child. What had gone wrong? Some researchers pointed to possible neurological factors. Brain imaging of Blank showed reduced activity in areas associated with empathy and emotional processing. Perhaps he'd been born with a predisposition toward psychopathy, and the right combination of life circumstances had activated it. Others argued that his emotional detachment was learned, a defensive mechanism that had spiraled out of control until it consumed his entire personality. The truth, as Dr. Chun ultimately concluded, was probably some complex interaction of biology, psychology, and circumstance that we still don't fully understand. "We want simple answers," she said. "We want to believe that serial killers are fundamentally different from us, that we could never become what they are. But the reality is more complicated and more frightening. Given the wrong genetic predispositions, the wrong life experiences, the wrong cascade of psychological deterioration, any of us might discover capacities for darkness we never knew existed." Detective Delaney retired 2 years after Blank's conviction, unable to continue in homicide after spending so much time immersed in that particular case. He'd seen evil before. 30 years as a cop guaranteed that, but something about Blank had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't shake. The emptiness in those eyes, the complete absence of normal human connection, haunted him. "The scariest thing about Blank," Delaney said in a rare interview years later, "was how normal he seemed. If you'd met him at a party, talked to him for 20 minutes, you wouldn't have noticed anything particularly off. He could mimic normal human interaction well enough to pass. It was only if you spent extended time with him, really paid attention, that you'd notice the hollowness underneath. Most of us never look that closely at anyone." The case changed how law enforcement approached serial killer investigations. Delaney's methodical approach, building a profile, looking for patterns, maintaining surveillance until evidence could be gathered, became a model for similar cases. The concept of the serial killer as a specific type of criminal, requiring specialized investigative techniques, gained mainstream acceptance in law enforcement circles. But it also raised disturbing questions about prevention. Could someone like blank have been identified before he started killing? Were there warning signs that might have allowed intervention before 13 people died? His ex-wife, interviewed years later, spoke about the emotional distance that had characterized their marriage, how she'd felt increasingly like she was living with a stranger who'd learned to imitate her husband. Looking back, knowing what I know now, I can see things that seemed off, she said. The way he talked about other people like they were objects to be manipulated rather than human beings. The complete absence of real affection, even early in the relationship when most couples are passionate. But at the time, I just thought he was reserved, maybe a little cold. I didn't know I was sleeping next to someone capable of murder. The question of what society owes to people who are psychologically damaged but haven't yet committed crimes remains ethically complex. We can't imprison people for what they might do. We can't force treatment on people who haven't broken laws. But we also know that people like blank exist, individuals who lack fundamental emotional connections, who view others as objects, who might, under the right or wrong circumstances, discover that killing is the only thing that makes them feel alive. In prison, blank continued to deteriorate. Without the ability to kill, he retreated further into his delusions, constructing elaborate philosophical frameworks to justify his actions. His journals became increasingly abstract, disconnected from reality. He wrote about consciousness and death, about the illusion of human significance, about his belief that he'd achieved something approaching enlightenment through murder. Guards reported that he spent most of his time alone in his cell, writing or sitting motionless for hours, staring at walls. He rarely spoke to other inmates, showed no interest in prison activities or programs. He'd retreated entirely into his own mind, that space where he'd first discovered the emptiness that had driven him to kill. Dr. Chun visited him for the last time 15 years into his sentence. She asked if he still felt no remorse for what he'd done. Blank considered the question with the same analytical detachment he brought to all discussions of his crimes. Remorse requires that I value something I destroyed, he said. I don't value things the way you do. I can't. The wiring isn't there, or it's broken, or it never formed properly. Asking if I feel remorse is like asking a blind person if they appreciate the colors in a painting. The conceptual framework for the question doesn't exist in my experience. But you understand that you caused suffering? Dr. Chun pressed. That families lost people they loved? That you destroyed lives? I understand it intellectually, blank replied. I can observe the suffering, analyze it, describe it. But I don't feel it. I never have. I'm sorry that disappoints you, that it doesn't fit the narrative arc you want, the redemption story, the criminal who finally understands what he's done. But I'm not capable of that transformation. I can't become something I'm not. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of blank psychology. His clear-eyed understanding of his own condition combined with complete inability or unwillingness to change. He knew he was broken. He just didn't care. The legacy of Daniel Blank extends beyond the 13 lives he took. His case became a touchstone in criminal psychology, cited in textbooks and courses on serial murder. His journals, carefully preserved as evidence, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a killer, not the mythologized monster of fiction, but the banal reality of a human being who'd lost his humanity. Families of victims eventually formed a support group, finding comfort in shared grief that others couldn't fully understand. They advocated for victims' rights legislation, for better mental health resources, for increased funding for homicide investigations. They refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, reduced to case numbers in a serial killer's journal. Some of them forgave blank, or at least claimed to, finding peace through religion or therapy or simple emotional exhaustion. Others remained consumed by rage even decades later, unable to move past the senseless loss. There is no correct way to respond to having someone you love randomly selected for murder by a man who wanted to feel something other than emptiness. Daniel Blank died in prison at age 68, his body discovered during morning rounds by guards who noted he'd been dead for several hours. Natural causes, a heart attack in his sleep. He left behind 40 years of journals, thousands of pages documenting his thoughts on consciousness, death, and human existence. Researchers still study them, still trying to understand the mind that produced them. In his final entry, written the night before he died, Blank reflected on his life with characteristic detachment. I spent 34 years dead inside, 13 months feeling alive, and 34 years imprisoned with my memories of those months. If I calculate the total correctly, I traded 68 years of emptiness for 13 months of sensation. Whether that was a fair exchange, I'll leave for others to debate. I made my choice, and I would make it again. Those 13 months cost 13 lives. 13 people who had families, dreams, futures. 13 stories cut short because one man's emptiness demanded to be filled, no matter the cost to anyone else. The monster is dead. The victims remain dead. The families continue grieving. The questions about how someone becomes a Daniel Blank, and whether we could recognize and prevent such transformation, remain unanswered. Evil, it turns out, isn't always dramatic or theatrical. Sometimes it's just emptiness that grew so vast it consumed everything human, leaving behind something that looked like a person but had become something else entirely. Something that could only feel alive when taking life from others. And somewhere, in cities across the world, other people are feeling that same emptiness, wrestling with that same absence of connection, standing at the edge of the same abyss that swallowed Daniel Blank whole. We can only hope they choose differently. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Boatman Case. A father's hands should protect, not destroy, but Leo Boatmans became instruments of unspeakable horror. What happens when the person meant to guard a child's innocence becomes the architect of their nightmare? We're diving into the twisted mind of a predator who wore the mask of a devoted family man, a respected neighbor, a trusted father. But behind closed doors, Leo Boatman transformed into something far more sinister, a creature who shattered the sacred bond between parent and child, leaving destruction in his wake that would echo through generations. Leo Boatman existed in plain sight, a phantom hiding behind the mundane routines of suburban American life. To those who passed him on tree-lined streets or exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store, he appeared unremarkable, a middle-aged man with graying hair, weathered hands, and the kind of forgettable face that blended seamlessly into any crowd. His home stood like countless others in the neighborhood, its lawn meticulously maintained, its exterior painted in neutral tones that whispered conformity rather than screamed danger. But normalcy, as investigators would later discover, served as Leo's most effective weapon. The Boatman household operated under rules that outsiders never witnessed. While neighbors observed what seemed like a typical American family navigating the ordinary challenges of daily existence, something far more disturbing festered within those walls. The windows that reflected sunlight during the day became barriers that concealed unspeakable acts when darkness fell. Those same walls that appeared so solid and protective actually imprisoned victims who had nowhere to run, no sanctuary to escape to, because the predator controlled every inch of their world. Leo cultivated his public persona with the precision of a master manipulator. He attended community events, maintained steady employment, and presented himself as a responsible provider. This carefully constructed facade proved remarkably effective. People trust what they think they see, and Leo understood that human beings desperately want to believe in the goodness of those around them. We crave stability, normalcy, the comforting illusion that monsters only exist in stories and distant news reports, never in our own backyards. The psychology behind predators like Leo reveals a chilling truth. They don't look monstrous. They don't announce their depravity with obvious warning signs or carry visible markers of their corruption. Instead, they weaponize trust, exploit vulnerability, and hide their true nature behind masks so convincing that even those closest to them fail to recognize the danger until it's far too late. Within the Boatman home, Leo established absolute dominion. His authority went unchallenged because he ensured that resistance carried consequences too terrible to risk. He controlled finances, dictated schedules, monitored communications, and created an environment where isolation became both punishment and prevention. Victims learned quickly that attempting to reach out for help would only result in escalated abuse, that speaking up meant facing retaliation more severe than the original violation. This pattern of control represents a hallmark of familial predators. They don't simply commit isolated acts of violence. They construct entire systems designed to perpetuate their access to victims while simultaneously preventing discovery. They manipulate perceptions, gaslight those who question them, and create scenarios where victims feel complicit in their own abuse, trapped by shame and fear and the terrible weight of keeping devastating secrets. Leo's methods evolved over time, growing more sophisticated as he refined his techniques. He studied his victims' reactions, identified their breaking points, and calibrated his approach to maximize both his satisfaction and his security. This wasn't impulsive behavior or momentary weakness. This was calculated, intentional, and sustained over an extended period that speaks to the methodical nature of his depravity. The children in Leo's orbit existed in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, never knowing when normalcy would shatter into violence, when a seemingly ordinary moment would transform into an opportunity for abuse. They learned to read micro-expressions on his face, to anticipate his moods based on subtle shifts in body language, to make themselves small and invisible in hopes of avoiding his attention. This constant state of threat assessment exhausted them mentally and emotionally, leaving psychological scars that would persist long after the physical abuse ended. Friends and extended family members who occasionally interacted with the Boatmans noticed nothing alarming, or at least nothing they felt confident addressing. Perhaps there were moments when something felt slightly off, when a child's behavior seemed unusual, when Leo's responses struck an odd chord. But cognitive dissonance is powerful. People tend to dismiss their instincts when those instincts conflict with established beliefs about someone's character. After all, this was Leo Boatman, stable, employed, present at family gatherings. Surely nothing terrible could be happening under his roof. This collective blindness enabled Leo's continued abuse. Every interaction where someone sensed something wrong but said nothing, every moment when concern got pushed aside in favor of maintaining social comfort, every instance where the benefit of the doubt got extended to the abuser rather than the victim, all of it created space for horror to flourish. The neighborhood itself became complicit through ignorance. Children played in yards adjacent to the Boatman home, their laughter carrying through open windows while atrocities occurred mere feet away. Families gathered for barbecues and block parties, exchanging recipes and lawn care tips with a man whose hands had committed acts that would haunt his victims for the rest of their lives. The proximity of normal life to unspeakable suffering creates a cognitive disconnect that challenges our understanding of how evil operates in ordinary spaces. Leo maintained this double life through meticulous compartmentalization. At work, he performed his duties competently, neither excelling nor failing in ways that would draw scrutiny. He cultivated relationships with colleagues that remained superficial enough to prevent genuine connection while still appearing socially functional. He remembered birthdays, contributed to office pools, participated in small talk about weather and sports, all the tiny social contracts that signal normalcy. Yet underneath this carefully maintained exterior, his mind constantly strategized about access, opportunity, and concealment. Predators like Leo exist in a perpetual state of calculation, always planning their next move, always assessing vulnerabilities, always ensuring their supply of victims remains uninterrupted. The cognitive load of maintaining such elaborate deception would overwhelm most people, but for Leo, it became second nature. A seamless integration of predation into the rhythm of everyday existence. The children trapped in his household learned to dissociate, to mentally separate themselves from the physical reality of what was happening to their bodies. They developed elaborate internal worlds where they could retreat during abuse, psychological sanctuaries that provided the only escape available to them. These coping mechanisms, while adaptive in the moment, would later complicate their healing, creating fragmented memories and gaps in their ability to process trauma. Leo exploited their confusion deliberately, mixing affection with abuse in ways that scrambled their understanding of love and violation. He would perpetrate horrific acts and then behave tenderly afterward, creating psychological bonds that trapped victims in cycles of fear and misplaced loyalty. This is how monsters maintain control, not through constant brutality, but through intermittent reinforcement that keeps victims hoping for the return of the good version of their abuser, never quite able to accept that both versions spring from the same corrupted source. As months turned into years, the weight of hidden trauma accumulated. Victims carried this burden through school, through interactions with friends, through every moment of their developing lives. They watched other children experience normal childhoods and couldn't articulate why their own experience felt so profoundly different. The isolation this created, being surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone with knowledge too terrible to share, inflicted damage that rivaled the physical abuse itself. Leo's reign of terror continued not because he was particularly clever or uniquely skilled at deception, but because systems designed to protect children failed, because adults looked away, because victims felt too ashamed and terrified to speak, because society still struggles to acknowledge that danger often wears familiar faces and lives at familiar addresses. Every predator's downfall begins with a crack in their carefully constructed facade, and for Leo Boatman, that fracture came from an unexpected direction. A moment when his control slipped, when a victim found the courage to break silence, when the conspiracy of normalcy finally shattered under the weight of accumulated horror. The disclosure didn't arrive as a dramatic confrontation or a planned revelation. Instead, it emerged gradually, painfully, through halting words spoken to a trusted adult who recognized that something in the child's behavior signaled deep distress. This adult, whether a teacher, counselor, or family friend, made the critical decision to listen without judgment, to believe without immediate skepticism, to prioritize the child's safety over social comfort. When authorities first received allegations against Leo Boatman, they confronted the challenge that plagues many familial abuse cases: untangling truth from a web of manipulation that had been constructed over years. Leo had invested considerable effort in establishing his reputation as a responsible family man, and that investment initially worked in his favor. Investigators knew from experience that false allegations occur, that family dynamics can be complex, that jumping to conclusions destroys lives. But they also knew that predators rely on exactly this hesitation, this institutional caution that buys them time and continued access to victims. The investigation proceeded methodically, with trained professionals conducting forensic interviews designed to elicit information without leading or traumatizing already vulnerable children. These conversations took place in carefully controlled environments, every word documented, every protocol followed to preserve the integrity of evidence that might eventually be presented in court. The children who had suffered under Leo's abuse now faced the additional trauma of recounting those experiences to strangers, describing acts they barely had vocabulary to name, reliving horror in service of justice. As details emerged, the scope of Leo's depravity became increasingly clear. This wasn't a single incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was systematic, sustained, and calculated abuse that had occurred over an extended period. The pattern revealed Leo's methodical approach, how he had groomed his victims through gradual boundary violations, how he had normalized inappropriate contact through incremental escalation, how he had leveraged his authority to silence opposition. Investigators also discovered evidence of his manipulation tactics. The ways he had convinced victims that they bore responsibility for the abuse, that disclosure would destroy the family, that no one would believe them if they spoke out. These psychological manipulations often prove more effective than physical restraints because they transform victims into their own jailers, trapped by internalized shame and misplaced guilt. During this phase, Leo maintained his facade of innocence with remarkable conviction. He denied allegations vehemently, portrayed himself as a victim of false accusations, and attempted to manipulate the narrative to position himself as a wrongly accused father targeted by misunderstandings or malicious intent. Predators rarely admit their crimes willingly, They defend their territory, their access, their carefully constructed lives with desperate intensity. His strategy relied on sowing doubt, suggesting that the children had been influenced by outside parties, that memories had been implanted or distorted, that normal parental affection had been misconstrued through the lens of modern hysteria about abuse. These arguments exploit legitimate concerns about suggestibility and false allegations while obscuring the mountain of evidence pointing toward guilt. But forensic evidence doesn't lie in the ways that people do. Physical examinations, psychological assessments, and patterns in victim testimony converge to paint a damning picture. When multiple victims independently describe similar experiences, when their accounts align in ways that spontaneous fabrication cannot explain, when physical evidence corroborates allegations, the truth becomes increasingly difficult to obscure. The community's reaction to Leo's arrest revealed deep divisions. Some neighbors expressed shock and disbelief, insisting that they had never witnessed anything suspicious, that Leo seemed like such a good man, that surely some terrible mistake had been made. Others admitted to harboring long-suppressed concerns, moments when they had sensed something wrong but convinced themselves they were overreacting. This community response represents a microcosm of society's broader struggle with acknowledging predatory behavior in familiar contexts. We want to believe that evil announces itself clearly, that we would recognize danger if it lived next door. The reality that ordinary-seeming people commit extraordinary atrocities challenges our sense of security and our confidence in our own judgment. For the victims and their advocates, watching the community grapple with these revelations added another layer of trauma. They had suffered in isolation while life continued normally around them, and now they witnessed people defending their abuser, questioning their credibility, mourning the loss of the man they thought they knew while seemingly forgetting the children whose lives he had destroyed. As the case built toward prosecution, forensic psychologists assessed Leo's mental state and risk of reoffense. Their evaluations revealed a profile consistent with serial predators. Lack of genuine empathy, persistent sexual interest in children, sophisticated grooming behaviors, and psychological characteristics that suggested high likelihood of continued abuse if given opportunity. These assessments would later inform sentencing recommendations, providing the court with expert opinions about the danger Leo posed to society. The legal process moved forward with agonizing slowness, as complex cases inevitably do. Defense attorneys filed motions, challenged evidence, and employed every legitimate tactic available to protect their clients' interests. Prosecutors meticulously prepared their case, knowing that conviction required meeting a high standard of proof, that any procedural error could jeopardize justice. Throughout this period, the victims endured continued trauma. The investigation itself, while necessary, forced them to repeatedly confront their abuse. They faced questions about the most intimate violations, had their credibility scrutinized by defense attorneys whose job required challenging their testimony, and lived with the uncertainty of whether the legal system would ultimately validate their experiences or allow their abuser to evade consequences. Support systems mobilized around the family. Therapists trained in trauma-informed care began the long process of helping victims process their experiences, develop healthy coping mechanisms, and begin rebuilding their sense of safety. Advocates navigated the complex intersection of child protective services, law enforcement, and therapeutic interventions, working to ensure that the children's needs remained central throughout the proceedings. Leo's wife, the children's mother, faced impossible decisions. Learning that her partner had perpetrated such heinous acts against their own children shattered her understanding of reality. She had to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster now revealed, had to navigate her own trauma while supporting her children through theirs, had to make practical decisions about housing and finances while her world collapsed. Many people judged the non-offending parent harshly in such cases, questioning how they could have remained ignorant of abuse occurring in their own home. But predators deliberately target vulnerable families, exploit trust, and leverage dynamics that prevent disclosure. The non-offending parent is often another victim of the abuser's manipulation, facing their own reckoning with betrayal and the devastating knowledge that they couldn't protect their children from danger that lived under the same roof. As evidence accumulated and the trial date approached, Leo's defense began to crumble. The weight of testimony, the consistency of victim accounts, the expert opinions, and the physical evidence created a case too strong to simply dismiss. Legal maneuvering could delay proceedings but couldn't erase the truth that Leo Boatman had committed terrible acts against vulnerable children entrusted to his care. The community watched as their neighborhood became the center of a criminal investigation, as media coverage transformed their quiet streets into a symbol of hidden horror. Property values declined. Families questioned their own safety and judgment. The collective trust that binds communities together sustained damage that would take years to repair. Yet amid this destruction, something important was happening. Silence was breaking. Victims were being heard. The conspiracy that had protected Leo through ignorance and denial was dissolving. The process was messy, painful, and imperfect, but it represented progress nonetheless, a collective decision that protecting children matters more than preserving comfortable illusions about the people who abuse them. The courtroom became an arena where competing narratives collided. Leo Boatman's desperate attempt to maintain his innocence against the mounting testimony of victims who had finally found their voices. The proceedings unfolded with a formality that seemed inadequate to contain the emotional weight of the accusations, the sterile legal language creating strange distance from the raw trauma being described. Prosecutors opened their case with methodical precision, laying out a timeline that documented Leo's pattern of abuse across multiple victims over an extended period. They presented evidence carefully, building from foundation to crescendo, ensuring that jurors understood not just individual incidents but the systematic nature of Leo's predation. Each piece of evidence, forensic reports, expert testimony, victim statements, contributed to a comprehensive picture of calculated cruelty. The victims who testified demonstrated extraordinary courage. Walking into that courtroom meant confronting their abuser directly, speaking their truth in front of strangers, enduring cross-examination designed to undermine their credibility. Child witnesses in particular face immense pressure. They must describe traumatic experiences while remaining composed, must withstand questioning that can feel like a secondary violation, must trust that the legal system will ultimately validate their suffering. Defense attorneys performed their constitutionally required role, challenging evidence and witnesses, highlighting any inconsistencies in testimony, suggesting alternative explanations for the allegations. They emphasized the seriousness of the charges, the life-altering consequences of conviction, the necessity of proof beyond reasonable doubt. This adversarial process, while essential to fair trials, can traumatize victims who experience vigorous cross-examination as an attack on their integrity. One victim's testimony particularly affected the courtroom. Speaking in a voice that wavered between strength and fragility, this young person described how Leo had systematically groomed them, how abuse had been normalized through gradual escalation, how fear and shame had kept them silent for years. The specificity of their account, the details that couldn't be fabricated, the emotional authenticity that resonated with painful truth, visibly moved several jurors. Leo's demeanor throughout the trial revealed his strategy. He projected wounded innocence, positioning himself as a victim of false accusations and misunderstanding. He maintained eye contact with jurors, attempting to establish connection and credibility. When victims testified, he shook his head in apparent disbelief, his body language communicating denial even as words piled up against him. But this performance couldn't overcome the accumulated weight of evidence. Forensic psychologists explained grooming behaviors and the psychological impact of familial abuse. Medical professionals presented physical findings consistent with sexual assault. Expert witnesses on child development clarified why victims often delay disclosure, why their accounts might contain gaps or inconsistencies, why trauma affects memory in ways that don't invalidate the core truth of their experiences. The prosecution's case built toward a conclusion that seemed increasingly inevitable. Leo Boatman had committed horrific crimes against vulnerable children, had exploited his position of trust and authority, had inflicted damage that would reverberate through his victims' lives indefinitely. The evidence wasn't perfect. It rarely is in cases involving crimes that occur in private, between family members years before disclosure, but it was compelling, consistent, and corroborated across multiple sources. Defense witnesses attempted to establish Leo's good character, describing him as a devoted father and responsible community member. But character witnesses face inherent limitations. They testify to public behavior, to the mask worn in social contexts, not to private acts committed behind closed doors. Their testimony confirmed only what investigators already knew, that Leo had successfully maintained a facade of normalcy that allowed his abuse to continue undetected. Closing arguments distilled weeks of testimony into competing narratives. The prosecution emphasized the courage of victims who had overcome fear and shame to speak their truth, the consistency of their accounts, the corroborating evidence that supported their allegations. They asked jurors to recognize Leo not as the respectable father he pretended to be, but as the predator he actually was, someone who had violated the most sacred trust that exists between parent and child. The defense made a final appeal to reasonable doubt, suggesting that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on testimony that might be influenced by coaching or false memories, that conviction would destroy an innocent man's life based on allegations that couldn't be proven with absolute certainty. They invoked the high standard required for criminal conviction, asking jurors to consider whether the state had truly met that burden. Jury deliberations lasted several days, long enough to suggest serious consideration, short enough to indicate that most jurors had reached similar conclusions relatively quickly. The wait created unbearable tension for everyone involved. Victims hoping their courage in testifying would result in justice, Leo maintaining his facade while internally calculating his chances, the community watching to see whether the legal system would protect children or allow a predator to evade consequences. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom erupted in emotional reactions that bailiffs struggled to contain. Guilty, on multiple counts, across multiple victims. The jury had weighed the evidence and found Leo Boatman criminally responsible for his actions. For the victims, this represented a moment of validation, official acknowledgement that their trauma was real, that their abuser would face consequences, that the system had ultimately recognized the truth they had carried alone for so long. Leo's reaction combined shock and rage. The mask of injured innocence slipped momentarily, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. Even in defeat, predators often refuse genuine accountability, clinging to their narrative of victimhood or persecution rather than confronting the reality of their crimes. Sentencing occurred several weeks later, after pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements were compiled. These statements gave victims an opportunity to address the court directly, to describe how Leo's abuse had affected their lives, to participate in the justice process beyond their role as witnesses. Many chose to speak, their words painting a devastating picture of trauma, betrayal, and the long road toward healing that still stretched ahead. One victim described nightmares that persisted years after the abuse ended, relationships damaged by an inability to trust, developmental milestones disrupted by the need to cope with trauma that should never have occurred. Another spoke about the stolen innocence, the confusion about normal family relationships, the shame that had no basis in their actions yet clung to them nonetheless. These statements humanized the criminal charges, transformed abstract legal counts into concrete suffering. The judge, faced with sentencing guidelines and the severity of Leo's crimes, handed down a sentence that reflected both the need for punishment and the protection of society. Decades in prison, registration as a sex offender, strict conditions should release ever occur. The sentence communicated clearly that familial abuse carries serious consequences, that betraying the trust of vulnerable children will not be minimized or excused. Leo's incarceration marked a transition but not an ending. For the victims, justice through conviction represented an important milestone, but healing remained a long-term process requiring ongoing therapeutic support, community backing, and their own resilience. For the community, the case became a cautionary tale about the danger that can hide behind normalcy, the importance of believing children who disclose abuse, the need for vigilance without paranoia. Some family members continued supporting Leo, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the criminal now imprisoned. This divided families further, creating additional trauma as victims found themselves pressured to forgive, to minimize their abuse, to prioritize family unity over their own healing. These dynamics illustrate how abuse creates ripples that extend far beyond the primary victims, damaging family systems and relationships in complex ways. The trial also exposed systemic failures. Moments when mandated reporters didn't report, when signs of abuse were rationalized away, when children's behavioral changes were attributed to normal development rather than investigated as potential indicators of trauma. These failures didn't cause Leo's crimes, but they allowed those crimes to continue longer than they should have, multiplying the harm inflicted. The conclusion of Leo Boatman's trial marked a beginning rather than an ending for those whose lives he had irrevocably damaged. Justice through conviction provided important validation, but healing from severe childhood trauma follows no predictable timeline, adheres to no neat narrative arc. The victims faced years, possibly lifetimes, of processing their experiences, managing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and reconstructing their understanding of safety, trust, and family. Therapeutic interventions became central to recovery. Trauma-informed therapists worked with victims using evidence-based approaches designed to help them process their experiences without re-traumatization. This required creating safe spaces where victims could explore their memories and emotions at their own pace, developing coping strategies for managing triggering situations, and gradually rebuilding their sense of agency and self-worth. Many survivors of childhood sexual abuse struggle with complex PTSD, a constellation of symptoms that extends beyond the classic diagnostic criteria to include difficulties with emotional regulation, distorted self-perception, and challenges in maintaining healthy relationships. These symptoms don't reflect weakness or permanent damage. They represent the mind's adaptive response to sustained trauma. With appropriate support, many survivors achieve meaningful healing and live fulfilling lives, though the journey remains challenging. The non-offending parent faced her own reckoning, discovering that her partner had abused their children while she remained unaware created layers of trauma. The betrayal by someone she had trusted and loved, the guilt about not protecting her children, the financial and practical challenges of suddenly becoming a single parent, and the need to process her own victimization by Leo's manipulation and deception. Support groups for non-offending parents provided a space where she could share her experience with others who understood the unique challenges she faced. These groups helped her recognize that Leo bore sole responsibility for his crimes, that predators deliberately create dynamics that prevent disclosure, that she too had been victimized by his manipulation even if not in the same way as her children. The community struggled with its own aftermath. Leo's crimes shattered assumptions about safety and trust that had allowed neighbors to live comfortably near one another. Parents became more vigilant about their children's well-being, more willing to have uncomfortable conversations about body safety and appropriate touch, more aware that danger doesn't announce itself with obvious warning signs. Some community members attended town halls where experts discussed child safety, warning signs of abuse, and the importance of creating environments where children feel safe disclosing. These educational efforts represented attempts to transform tragedy into prevention, to ensure that Leo's crimes resulted in increased protection for other vulnerable children. But the community response wasn't uniformly positive. Some neighbors resented the attention, the way their streets had become associated with horror, the property value impacts, and social stigma that followed. Others engaged in victim blaming, suggesting that the children must have somehow contributed to or misunderstood the situation, a defensive reaction that allowed them to maintain illusions about their ability to protect their own families. This victim blaming represents one of the most damaging societal responses to sexual abuse. It transfers responsibility from the perpetrator to the victim, reinforces shame that already burdens survivors, and creates environments where future victims remain silent rather than risk being blamed for crimes committed against them. Combating this requires consistent messaging that abuse is always the perpetrator's fault, that children bear no responsibility for adults' criminal behavior, that disclosure deserves belief and support rather than skepticism. Educational institutions where Leo's victims had attended also faced scrutiny. Had teachers missed signs of abuse? Had school counselors received adequate training to recognize trauma symptoms? Were protocols in place for handling disclosures appropriately? These questions didn't necessarily indicate that schools had failed, but rather highlighted the need for ongoing training and vigilance across all systems that interact with children. Many schools implemented enhanced training following Leo's conviction, ensuring that staff understood mandated reporting requirements, could recognize behavioral indicators of abuse, and knew how to respond supportively when children disclosed concerning information. These systemic improvements represented positive outcomes from tragedy, changes that might protect future children from similar abuse. The legal system itself underwent examination. Had the investigation been handled optimally? Were there procedural changes that could better serve child victims while still protecting defendants' rights? How could the system reduce the secondary trauma that victims experience when participating in prosecution? Some jurisdictions implemented reforms allowing children to testify via closed-circuit television to avoid direct confrontation with their abusers. Others created specialized courts focused on child abuse cases, with judges and attorneys trained in trauma-informed practices. These improvements acknowledge that traditional adversarial proceedings, while necessary for fair trials, can inadvertently traumatize already vulnerable witnesses. Prevention emerged as a critical focus in the aftermath. Child safety advocates emphasize that the vast majority of abuse is perpetrated by family members or trusted adults rather than strangers, a reality that requires different prevention strategies than the stranger danger messaging many grew up with. Effective prevention includes teaching children anatomically correct names for body parts, establishing that no one should touch them in ways that make them uncomfortable, and creating family cultures where children feel safe reporting boundary violations. Leo's case also highlighted the importance of believing children when they disclose. Research consistently shows that false allegations of sexual abuse by children are extremely rare, far rarer than actual abuse that goes unreported. Yet skepticism toward child witnesses remains pervasive, rooted partly in discomfort with acknowledging that abuse occurs with disturbing frequency, partly in cognitive biases that favor established adults over children with limited power and credibility. The conviction and sentencing sent a message that carried beyond Leo's specific case. Familial sexual abuse will be taken seriously, prosecuted vigorously, and punished severely. This message matters because predators often rely on the assumption that they won't be believed, that family loyalty will prevent disclosure, that the system won't invest resources in protecting children from parents or caretakers. Yet significant challenges remain. Many victims never disclose their abuse. Many disclosures never result in prosecution due to evidentiary challenges, statute of limitations issues, or victims' unwillingness to participate in traumatic legal proceedings. Even successful prosecutions cannot undo the harm already inflicted or guarantee that survivors will receive the support they need for healing. The Boatman children faced particular challenges as they matured. Childhood sexual abuse correlates with increased risks for mental health struggles, substance abuse, difficulties in romantic relationships, and revictimization in adulthood. These correlations don't represent destiny. Many survivors build healthy, successful lives, but they underscore the need for long-term support rather than assuming that conviction or therapy completion resolves trauma. Some survivors became advocates themselves, using their experiences to educate others, support fellow survivors, or push for systemic reforms. This activism represented a way of transforming trauma into purpose, of ensuring that their suffering contributed to protecting other children. But advocacy also carried risks of re-traumatization and burnout, requiring careful attention to boundaries and self-care. Years after Leo's conviction, the victims continued processing their experiences in evolving ways. Adolescence brought new challenges as they navigated romantic relationships and sexuality while managing trauma histories. Adulthood raised questions about whether to disclose their abuse to partners, how to approach parenting if they chose to have children, how to maintain their own vigilance without becoming hypervigilant or overprotective. The story of Leo Boatman doesn't conclude with his imprisonment. It continues in the lives of those he harmed, in the community forever changed by the revelation of horrors hiding in plain sight, in the systemic reforms implemented to prevent similar abuse. His crimes serve as a stark reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, that predators thrive in environments where people are reluctant to acknowledge danger, and that protecting children requires constant vigilance combined with compassion for those who find the courage to break silence. Every person who believes a child's disclosure, every mandated reporter who fulfills their responsibility, every community that prioritizes child safety over social comfort, they all contribute to creating environments where predators like Leo Boatman cannot operate with impunity. The case stands as both tragedy and call to action. Tragedy for the innocence destroyed and childhood stolen. Call to action for all who have capacity to recognize, report, and respond to child abuse. Leo Boatman will remain incarcerated for decades, his access to victims permanently severed, his ability to cause further harm constrained by prison walls. But the legacy of his crimes extends far beyond his individual punishment, challenging all of us to examine how we protect the vulnerable, how we respond when comfortable illusions crumble, and whether we possess the courage to act when children's safety demands it. The victims, meanwhile, continue their journeys toward healing, journeys that honor their resilience while acknowledging the very real impacts of trauma. Their courage in speaking out, in participating in prosecution, in continuing to move forward despite what was stolen from them, represents a form of strength that deserves recognition and support. They are more than what happened to them, more than their trauma, more than victims of Leo Boatman's depravity. They are survivors, and their stories remind us why protecting children must remain an absolute priority, why belief and support matter so profoundly, and why silence, no matter how comfortable it may seem, can never be acceptable when innocence hangs in the balance. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.